The letter never reached her. That was what Howard Hale had made sure of. Every single one of them, for 3 years straight. Margaret's father had stood at the mailbox on the county road, morning after morning, and pulled out every envelope with Elias Mercer's handwriting before his daughter could see. He'd burned them in the iron barrel behind the barn, one by one, watching the smoke rise into the Wyoming sky with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he was protecting something. He wasn't protecting anything. He was destroying it. When Margaret finally stopped watching the road for Elias, when she stopped flinching every time a horse came around the bend, Howard Hale had poured himself a whiskey and called it a good year's work. He died 3 winters later without saying a word about any of it. If this story already has your heart, you're not alone. Hundreds of thousands of viewers have found this channel because they needed something real. If you're new here, please take 1 second and hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. And if this story moves you, tap the like button and drop a comment below. Tell me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The boy was asleep before they cleared the last ridge. Elias felt the weight of him shift, that specific boneless heaviness that only happens when a child completely surrenders to exhaustion, and he adjusted his grip across Finn's thighs without breaking stride. 3 years old and still small for his age, Finn had his mother's dark lashes and her habit of curling his fingers into a fist when he slept, like he was holding on to something in a dream. Elias tried not to look at that fist too often. It made his chest do things he couldn't afford right now. The ranch came into view just as the late afternoon light turned the valley amber. He almost stopped walking. He hadn't let himself picture it, not once during the 4-day ride north. He told himself it was just a place, stone and timber and fence posts. But standing on the ridge looking down at the Hale property, the windmill still turning, the main house still painted that particular shade of faded white that no other house in Wyoming seemed to have, he felt something crack open behind his sternum that he'd been keeping sealed for 12 years. He kept walking. The gate at the bottom of the drive was new, iron, solid, with a chain and padlock. Elias had expected that. He also expected the dog, a big black cattle dog, who came around the corner of the barn at a dead run, barking with a seriousness that suggested she'd never found anything funny in her life. Finn stirred at the sound, lifted his head from Elias's shoulder. "Dog," Finn said, with the calm, factual certainty of someone making an important announcement. "Yeah," Elias said. "Stay still." The dog pulled up 6 feet short of the gate and stood there barking, hackles up, reading him with those amber eyes the way working dogs do. Not threatening, exactly, but making an absolute promise. Elias held his ground and waited. After a moment, the dog dropped from bark to growl and then to a low, watching silence. That was when the screen door opened. He heard it before he saw her. That specific sound, the wooden frame, the spring that had always been wound slightly too tight, was so familiar that his body registered it before his brain caught up. And then Margaret Hale was standing on the porch steps with a rifle leveled at the center of his chest, and the late sun was behind her, and 12 years collapsed into nothing. She looked exactly like herself. That was the first thing. Older, yes. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before, and her dark hair had one streak of gray coming in at the left temple that she hadn't done anything to hide. She was wearing work clothes, canvas trousers, and a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled past her elbows. She looked like a woman who had been doing hard things for a long time and had stopped expecting anyone to notice. The rifle didn't waver. "Margaret," he said. She said nothing. Her eyes moved from his face to the child on his back, and something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, more like a calculation being interrupted. She wasn't expecting a child. That much was clear. "I know I don't have any right to be standing here," Elias said. He kept his voice steady. "I'm not asking for anything beyond 5 minutes. If you want me gone after that, I'll go." "Then start walking," Margaret said. "You've wasted 4 of them already. I have nowhere else to take him." Silence. The dog sat down in the dirt, still watching. "His mother?" Margaret said, and her voice had changed. The hard edge was still there, but underneath it something careful had entered, the way a person speaks when they're asking a question they're already afraid of. "Died 14 months ago," Elias said. Fever. It was fast. Margaret looked at Finn again. The boy had gone still on Elias's back, the way children go still when they sense that the adults around them are deciding something important. He was watching Margaret with enormous dark eyes and holding onto Elias's collar with both hands. He hungry? Margaret said. We both are. Another silence. It stretched long enough that Elias genuinely wasn't sure which way it was going to break. He'd told himself on the way down the ridge that he wouldn't beg. He'd meant it. But standing there with Finn's weight on his back and his legs aching from 4 days of hard road and the smell of the Hale Ranch coming to him on the evening wind, hay and iron and wood smoke, he understood that meaning something and being able to hold to it were two separate propositions. Margaret lowered the rifle. The gate's not locked, she said. I never got around to getting a key made. She turned and went back inside without waiting for him to answer. Elias stood there for a moment. Then he lifted the latch on the gate, swung it open, and walked through. The inside of the house was different than he remembered, and exactly the same. The furniture had shifted, a different table, a chair he didn't recognize near the fireplace. But the bones of the place were unchanged, the smell of it, the way the floorboards in the hallway spoke when you walked on them. Margaret was at the stove, her back to him, and she didn't turn around when he came in. Put him on the settle, she said, meaning the long bench along the near wall. There's a blanket in the chest under the window. Elias lifted Finn down carefully and laid him on the bench. The boy didn't fully wake, just turned onto his side and pulled his knees up, still gripping something invisible in his fist. Elias found the blanket and covered him, tucked it under his chin the way Finn liked, and then stood up and turned to find Margaret watching him from across the room. She looked away immediately, moved a pot, made a sound like she'd been about to say something and decided against it. You're still running this place alone? Elias said. I have a hand who comes out 3 days a week, Carl Briggs. You wouldn't know him. How long since your husband passed? Her shoulders tightened. 2 years, March. I'm sorry. You didn't know him. I'm sorry for you, Elias said, not for him. She turned around at that, and for a moment she just looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Somewhere between anger and something rawer than anger, something that had been sitting under the anger for a long time and wasn't used to being seen. Sit down, she said, before you fall down. He sat. She put bread on the table and a bowl of yesterday's stew that she heated without ceremony, and a cup of coffee that was strong enough to take paint off a barn. He ate without speaking because she clearly didn't want conversation while she was working through whatever she was working through. Finn slept on the settle. The dog, she'd come inside at some point without Elias noticing, lay down under the table near his feet like she'd already made some private decision about him. After a while, Margaret sat across from him with her own cup. You look terrible, she said. I feel worse than I look. Where have you been? South, mostly. Montana for 2 winters. New Mexico for a year. Wherever there was work. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The drought hit hard everywhere south of here. 3 outfits I worked for went under inside of 8 months. After Ruth died, I tried to get something steady, but he stopped. Every place I went, a man with a baby on his back wasn't exactly what they were hiring. What were you going to do if I'd sent you away? Keep walking, I guess. North of here, there's nothing for 60 miles. I know. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She turned her cup in her hands, looking at it, and then looked at him directly, with the focused, appraising look of someone who has learned through experience that the world will lie to them if they give it the opportunity. Why here, she said, after 12 years? Why come here? It was a fair question. It was the question he'd been asking himself for 4 days. Because I didn't know where else you go, he said, when you've run out of everywhere else. That wasn't the whole answer, and they both knew it. But it was true as far as it went, and Margaret seemed to accept it as such. She nodded once, slowly, and looked back at her cup. The spring pasture fence is down in 3 places, she said. The west well is giving bad water. I've got 12 head of cattle that need moving before the month's out. And Carl can't come more than 3 days a week because his own place needs him. Elias waited. I can't pay you much, she said. But there's the small room off the kitchen. It's not large, but your son could sleep in there with you until... She stopped, started again. Until something better comes along. Margaret, I'm not doing this for you, she said quickly, firmly, like she was nailing a board into place. I want you to understand that. I'm doing this because I need a hand and you need a roof, and that boy needs... She glanced at Finn on the settle. He needs a bed and proper food. That's all this is. All right, Elias said. You don't argue? Would it help if I did? She almost smiled. It happened so fast he wasn't entirely sure he'd seen it. A slight change at one corner of her mouth, immediately contained. No, she said. Then I won't argue. She stood up and took his empty bowl to the basin without another word. Elias sat at the table and listened to the house settle around him in the cooling evening air and thought about how strange it was that the most dangerous place he'd ever been was also the one place in the world that felt, against all reason and evidence and common sense, like somewhere he might be able to breathe. He was wrong about it being safe, of course, but he didn't know that yet. The first morning was practical and almost entirely wordless. Margaret was up before dawn. He heard her boots on the floorboards through the thin wall between the kitchen and the side room where he and Finn had slept. And by the time he came out, she had coffee made and a list written on the back of an envelope sitting on the table next to the cup. Not a list for conversation, a list for work. Fence sections that needed repair, the location of the tool shed, the pasture rotation schedule, where to find the wire and post hole diggers. He read it while he drank the coffee. She came back in from the porch, looked at him reading it, and went to the stove. The well, he said. You said it's giving bad water. What kind of bad? Sulfur smell started about 3 weeks ago. Has the water level dropped? Significantly? Any livestock sick from it? Not yet. I stopped them drinking from it 2 weeks ago. He nodded, filing this away. I'll look at the fence first, then the well. The fence is more urgent. I know, that's why I said first. She looked at him. He looked at her. This was, he would come to understand, the characteristic mode of their mornings. Two people trying to establish a working language after years of speaking different ones. Finn wakes up hungry, he said. He won't ask. He'll just stand somewhere looking at things until someone feeds him. If I'm not back... I know how to feed a child, Margaret said. I didn't say you didn't. Your tone suggested it. He started to say something and then decided not to. She turned back to the stove. He took the envelope and went to find the tool shed. Finn was still sleeping when he left. He'd sleep another hour, probably, and then wake up and pad out to the kitchen on his bare feet and stand in the doorway looking at whatever was happening with those wide, serious eyes of his. Elias knew it. He just hadn't quite figured out how to explain to his 3-year-old that the woman in the kitchen wasn't dangerous exactly, but she wasn't safe either. She was something more complicated than either of those things. The fence was worse than the list had suggested. The sections Margaret had marked were clearly gone. Posts rotted at the base, wire sagging, and in 2 places broken entirely. But when Elias walked the full line, he found another 100 yards that was barely standing, the wire held up more by tension and habit than by anything structural. Someone had patched it in places with whatever was at hand: baling wire, a piece of chain, in one section what appeared to be a leather belt twisted through the rings. The repairs had the look of a person working alone at the end of a long day when there wasn't enough time or material to do it properly. He pulled out one of the rotted posts and turned it in his hands. It had been in the ground too long. The whole fence line needed replacing, not patching. That was 2 weeks of work, minimum, and that was before he got to the well. He put the post down and looked out across the pasture. The land itself was good, even through the drought, and you could see where it had hit, the grass thin and brown in the lower sections, the creek running low in its channel. The underlying soil was quality. This was workable land. With water and time and enough hands, this was the kind of place that lasted. He went back to get his tools and start on what he could do in a day. Around mid-morning, he heard small feet in the grass behind him. He didn't turn around immediately. He'd been expecting this. Hey, buddy, he said, driving a new post with the next swing of the maul. What you doing? Finn said. Fixing fence. Finn came and stood next to him. Not too close. He'd learned to stay back from swinging tools, and watched with the intense focused attention that he gave to any project that involved hitting things. Can I help? Hand me that next post. The short one. Finn picked up the post, which was approximately his own height, with enormous seriousness and dragged it over. Elias took it without comment and set it in the hole. The lady gave me eggs, Finn said. Margaret. She said I could call her Maggie. Elias stopped, held the post steady. Did she? She said only if I wanted. What did you decide? Finn thought about this with genuine gravity, the way he decided most things. I'll see, he said. Elias laughed. He hadn't planned to. It just came out, short and surprised, the way laughter does when it finds a gap in your defenses. That's smart, he said. Don't commit too early. She has chickens. I noticed. She lets me collect eggs. Does she watch you or do you go alone? She watches from the porch. She drinks coffee and watches. Finn paused. She doesn't talk much. No, Elias agreed. She doesn't. Are we staying? And there it was. That question, delivered in Finn's flat, honest voice that never softened anything on purpose, just said the thing directly because he didn't yet know why you wouldn't. Elias drove the post, lined it up, checked the level with his eye. For a while, he said. Yeah. Okay, Finn said, entirely satisfied with this. He picked up a small rock and turned it over in his hands, examining it, and moved on to whatever the next thing was. Elias watched him go and felt the familiar complicated thing, that mix of pride and grief and something that might have been love if he'd had more room to hold it properly, and then turned back to the fence. By evening, he'd replaced 11 posts and restrung 4 sections. It wasn't enough, but it was a day's work, and honest work left a different feeling in the body than any other kind. He washed at the pump near the barn and went inside to find Finn already asleep on his cot in the side room, and Margaret at the table with what appeared to be a stack of bills and account ledgers spread in front of her. She didn't look up when he came in. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her, not too close. Watched her work the numbers on a piece of paper, crossing things out and starting again. It's worse than the fence, he said. She didn't look up. What is? The money. I can see it from here. Her pencil stopped. She looked up then, and the expression on her face was the kind that comes when someone has been managing a private catastrophe alone and they're not at all sure how they feel about being seen. The drought took the summer profits, she said flatly, and before that my husband's last year was… She stopped. He was sick for a long time before he died. The medical bills were substantial. How far behind are you? The bank note is due in 60 days. She set the pencil down. I need a strong spring sale. Better than last year. Significantly better. The south herd needs moving before you can get them into prime condition. I know that. And the well needs fixing before the cattle go onto the south pasture at all. I know that too. So the well is actually the first problem. She looked at him steadily. I said the fence was more urgent. You said the fence needed to come first. I'm saying the well has to come before the south pasture rotation, which means it's part of the same problem. A pause. You're reordering my list. I'm saying your list is correct, but the sequence needs adjusting. She picked the pencil back up and turned it end over end between her fingers. You've been here one day, she said. I know, and you're already reorganizing my priorities. You can tell me I'm wrong, he said, if I'm wrong. She didn't tell him he was wrong. She looked at the ledger and then at the piece of paper with her crossed-out numbers, and then back at the ledger. Her jaw was tight. He could see her working against whatever reflex wanted to push back, measuring it against the practical reality on the paper in front of her. The well first, she said finally, then the rest of the fence, then move the herd. That's what I'd do, he said. Don't, she said, and her voice had an edge now. Not anger exactly, but something close to it, something personal. Make me feel grateful to you. I can't afford that right now. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since he'd come through the gate. At the tiredness under her eyes that wasn't just about today. At the way she was holding herself, straight-backed and careful, like someone who had learned that if she ever let herself slump, she might not come back up. All right, he said. I won't. She nodded, turned back to her numbers. He finished his coffee and went to bed. He lay in the dark in the small room off the kitchen, listening to Finn breathe and listening to the windmill turning outside the window, and thought about the letters he had written. 41 of them. He'd counted over the years when he couldn't sleep. 41 letters in the 3 years he'd been away, working his way through the hard season, saving money to come back with something real to offer. 41 letters with no answer. He told himself she'd moved on. He told himself she'd found someone who hadn't left. He'd told himself all the things you tell yourself when the silence becomes unbearable and you need an explanation that you can actually live with. He'd never thought she didn't get them. He didn't think it now. Not fully. Not yet. But there was something in the way Margaret had looked at him today. Not with the anger of someone who had received 41 letters and chosen not to answer, but with the bleak, closed-off pain of someone who had been abandoned. That was sitting in the back of his mind like a stone he hadn't found a place to put down yet. He fell asleep thinking about it. The second day he went down into the well. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. The underground seam had shifted, probably a result of the drought drying the upper soil layers enough to allow some subsidence, and a section of the stone lining had cracked, allowing sulfur-bearing groundwater to leach in from a secondary pocket. It was fixable. Not quick, not cheap, but fixable. He came up out of the well with the news, and Margaret listened without expression, and then said, "How long?" 4 days to properly seal it, maybe 5. Materials? I'll make you a list. She took the list to town herself that afternoon while Carl Briggs, the hired hand, a quiet, lean man in his 50s, who regarded Elias with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to form opinions too quickly, came out to help move some of the stock. Elias worked through the afternoon on a section of fence he could do without the materials. When Margaret came back in the early evening, the wagon was loaded with limestone and sealant compound and 30 feet of new clay tile. She'd spent money she didn't easily have. He didn't say anything about it. That night, after Finn was in bed, he was at the table working out the repair schedule when he heard Margaret in the room she used as a study, going through what sounded like a box or a drawer. He heard a particular sound, papers moving, and then a pause, and then silence. He went back to his schedule. 20 minutes later, she appeared in the kitchen doorway with a folded piece of paper in her hand and an expression that he had no ready category for. "I found this," she said, "in my husband's desk, going through the estate papers." She put the paper on the table. He looked at it. It was a letter, his handwriting. The world did something strange and disorienting in the next moment. It stayed exactly the same while also fundamentally changing, the way it does when something you thought you understood turns out to have a different shape than you believed. He unfolded it. He didn't need to read it. He knew what it said, more or less, the way you remember something you wrote when you were 22 and desperate. But he read it anyway, because the alternative was to look at Margaret's face, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. It was the third letter he'd written, the one in November, when the first winter was starting and he'd gotten word of steady work in Colorado if he wanted it, and he was trying to explain that he wasn't taking the Colorado job, that he was coming back in the spring, that she should wait. She should wait. He set the letter down. "Where was it?" he said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. "In the back of the bottom drawer, tucked inside a ledger from 1887. She was standing with her arms crossed, and her face was doing something complicated and effortful, like she was trying to keep several different things from happening at once. There was a name written on the outside of the ledger, in my father's handwriting. Elias didn't say anything. "My father," Margaret said, and her voice was precise and careful in the way that voices get when emotion is being held at a very specific distance, "died without ever mentioning that you had written to me." The silence in the kitchen was the loudest thing Elias had ever heard. "How many?" Margaret said. "How many did you write?" He looked at the letter on the table. 41, he said. "Over 3 years." Something moved through her face, a wave of something that went too fast for him to name, and then she turned and walked out of the kitchen. He heard the back door open and close. He sat at the table. He sat there for a long time. Outside, the windmill turned in the dark, and the cattle shifted in the near pasture, and somewhere across the valley a coyote called once and received no answer. Elias Mercer sat at the table in Margaret Hale's kitchen and looked at his own handwriting on a 12-year-old piece of paper and understood, for the first time, what had actually happened. Not what he had built the last 12 years on top of, the actual thing. She hadn't chosen anyone over him. She had waited. And whoever had answered for her, whoever had let her believe that silence was his answer, had done it one letter at a time, carefully, consistently, over 3 full years, until the silence was deep enough that neither of them had any reason left to look across it. He thought about Howard Hale. He'd only met the man twice. A quiet, controlled person with precise opinions and a habit of sitting very still when he was making a decision. He thought about how Margaret had said the letter was in her husband's desk. And he thought about how a woman who had watched the road for Elias's letters for 3 years would have responded if she'd known her father had the answers to every question she'd ever asked. He didn't say any of this to anyone. He folded the letter and put it back on the table and went outside to find her. She was standing at the fence of the near pasture, her arms over the top rail, looking at nothing in particular. He came and stood beside her, not too close, and looked at the same nothing. After a while, she said, "I married Robert 6 months after I stopped expecting you." He didn't say anything. "He was a decent man," she said. "He worked hard and he was honest and he never—" She stopped. "I wasn't unhappy. I want you to know that. I wasn't some woman who spent 20 years miserable because of what I thought you'd done." "All right," he said. "But I was—" She stopped again, tried again. "I was angry. For a long time I was very angry, and I didn't know what I was angry at, and that's a particular kind of—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Yeah," he said, "and now I find out—" She turned to look at him directly, and her eyes were dry, but her voice had an edge that sounded less like anger and more like someone trying to find the floor in the dark. "What do I do with this, Elias? My father has been dead for 10 years. My husband has been dead for 2. What do I do with the information that the last 40 years of my life were built on a decision someone else made without telling me?" He had no good answer for that. He knew he didn't. He didn't try to pretend otherwise. "I don't know," he said. "That's not helpful." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She turned back to the pasture. An owl called somewhere behind the barn. "In the morning," she said finally, "you'll start on the well." "Yes." "And we won't—" She paused. "We're not going to figure this out tonight, or soon, or maybe ever. I need you to understand that." "I understand it." "Because I am not the same person I was at 22, she said. "And you're not either. And whatever we thought we were to each other back then was—" She shook her head. "It was something, but it was a long time ago." "It was," he said. "So you stay and work the ranch," she said. "That's what this is." "All right. And I don't know what else it is. I need time." "Margaret," he said, and she went still, and he said it carefully, with the full weight of what he meant by it. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, pushed off the fence rail and walked back toward the house. He stood at the fence in the dark for a while after she went in, listening to the cattle move in the pasture and the windmill turn overhead, and let himself feel, for the first time in 12 years, something that wasn't quite hope. It was too raw and uncertain and newly excavated for that, but was adjacent to it. Something that meant the same direction. The well repair took 6 days. The fence took 9 more after that. On the 15th day of his being at the Hale Ranch, Elias moved the south herd to the rotational pasture, with Carl Briggs's help, and Finn riding on the saddle in front of him, solemn with responsibility, waving a stick at any cow who looked at him sideways. Margaret stood at the gate and watched them bring the herd through. She was drinking coffee. She didn't say anything. But when Finn rode past her on the horse, sitting up straight and wearing a look of profound professional dignity, she said, clearly and without particular emphasis, "Nice work, Cowboy." Finn turned around on the saddle and looked at her with an expression of such complete and unguarded joy that Elias had to look away at the horizon for a moment before he trusted his face again. In the evenings after that, the 3 of them sometimes sat on the porch. Not always. Not by arrangement. But it happened naturally, the way things happen when people share a space long enough. Finn would be on the step with whatever he'd found that day, a stone, or a feather, or a small piece of quartz that he was convinced was important, and Elias would be in the chair with his coffee, and Margaret would come out with hers, and they would sit. They didn't talk much on those evenings, but the silence, Elias noticed, had changed. It was no longer the silence of 2 people who had nothing left to say to each other. It was the different kind, the kind that exists between people who have found they can occupy the same quiet without it costing them anything. He didn't point this out to her. He was learning, at 44, a lesson he probably should have learned at 22. Some things become true on their own schedule, and the worst thing you can do is hurry them. The smoke on the ridgeline appeared on a Tuesday morning in late summer. Just a thin thread of it, gray-white against the blue sky, rising from somewhere above the western tree line. Elias saw it from the south pasture and stood watching it for a full minute before he said anything to Carl. "That's high up," Carl said. "It's not a cooking fire," Elias said. "No. They looked at it together. The air was hot and dry, and had been hot and dry for 3 months. The creek was down to half its normal depth. The grass in the lower pastures crackled under your boots in the afternoon. "I'll ride up for a look," Elias said. "You want company?" "Keep the cattle watered. I'll be back before evening." He wasn't back before evening. What he found on the ridge 3 miles above the valley was not a small fire. It was a wildfire that had started 2 ridges further west, driven by the same conditions that had dried everything out: the drought, the heat, a lightning strike from the dry storm 2 nights ago that had lit several spots simultaneously and then watched them merge over the course of a day. The Forest Service ranger he encountered on the ridge road had the flat, measured voice of someone who was trying to keep fear out of his professional assessment and mostly succeeding. "How fast?" Elias said. "If the wind holds from the west, you've got maybe—" The ranger looked at the sky. 3 days, maybe less, depends on tonight. The valley below. The Hale Ranch. "Everything in this valley is going to need to start thinking about evacuation," the ranger said. Elias rode back down the mountain faster than he'd come up. He came in through the kitchen door at full stride, and Margaret turned from the stove and looked at his face and set down the spoon she was holding. "How bad?" she said. "Bad, bad," he said. "We need to talk about what we're doing if it comes to us." "If," she said. "When," he said. "Margaret, we need to talk about what we're doing when it comes." She held his gaze for a long moment, and in that moment something passed between them that was different from the careful managed distance of the last 2 weeks. Something that recognized, without either of them saying it, that what was coming was going to require a different kind of arrangement than the one they'd been maintaining. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me everything you saw." He sat. He told her. And as he talked, watching her listen with the focused, unblinking attention of someone who has managed a ranch alone and knows how to make fast decisions with incomplete information, he thought that whatever they were to each other, and he still didn't know, and she still didn't know, and maybe that was honest, they were at least this: 2 people who, when the crisis came, turned toward each other instead of away. It was, he thought, a beginning. Even if everything else was still uncertain, even if the fire was coming, even if he still didn't know what 41 unanswered letters meant for 2 people who were no longer 22 and had no map for the country they'd ended up in. Even so. He kept talking, and she kept listening, and outside, very far away, the smoke continued to rise. The smoke changed overnight. Elias knew it before he fully woke up. Something in the quality of the air coming through the cracked window had shifted, a density to it that hadn't been there the night before, and his body registered it as a threat before his mind caught up with the reason. He lay still for a moment in the dark, listening. The windmill, the cattle in the near pasture, Finn breathing on the cot across the room, and under all of it, so faint you could convince yourself it wasn't there, the smell of burning timber, carried down from the ridge on a wind that had turned sometime in the night and was now coming from the west. He got up without waking Finn and went to the kitchen window. The sky above the western ridgeline was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the wall of orange that would mean immediate crisis, but wrong in the way that experienced people recognize, a reddish cast to the pre-dawn dark that had nothing to do with sunrise. He stood at the window for 2 minutes, watching it, and then went to get his boots. Margaret was already at the table when he came in. She had a cup of coffee and the same flat, focused expression she'd worn when he'd told her about the fire the previous evening. She'd clearly been up for a while. There was a second cup already poured sitting across from her. "Wind shifted," she said. "I noticed." "When did you wake up?" 20 minutes ago. He sat down, pulled the coffee toward him. "You?" "I didn't really sleep." She said it without apology or self-pity, just as fact. "I kept thinking about the South herd. If we need to move them ahead of schedule." "We do," he said. "Not in a week. Today." She looked at him steadily. "The pasture rotation? Forget the rotation. The south pasture is the closest thing we have to a fire break on that side. And if the fire jumps the lower ridge before we can get the cattle out, they'll be trapped between the fence and the tree line." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "We move them today, Margaret. All of them." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her running the math, the time, the manpower, the distance, Carl Briggs's availability, Finn's presence making every physical task marginally more complicated. "Carl can't come until Thursday," she said. Then it's us. That's 38 head. I've moved larger herds with fewer people. With a 3-year-old on the property. Finn stays near the barn, Elias said. He knows how to follow instructions when it matters. I'll make sure he understands it matters. Margaret looked at him for a long moment with that measuring expression that he'd come to understand wasn't distrust of him specifically. It was simply the look of a person who had learned to check every assumption before committing to it, because the cost of a wrong assumption, out here, working alone, was higher than most people wanted to calculate. All right, she said. We start after breakfast. He nodded, drank the coffee. There's something else, she said, and her voice changed, just slightly, dropping into a register that was different from the operational tone they'd been using. She pushed something across the table toward him. It was a small stack of envelopes, 4 of them, all opened, all old. He could see the yellowing of the paper edges, his handwriting on the outside of each one. He went still. I kept looking, she said. After I found the first one, I went through everything in the study. The bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, behind the insurance papers. She paused. There was a ledger there too, my father's, from 1886 through 1889. She stopped again, and when she started again, her voice was precise and controlled in the way of someone who has decided exactly how much they're going to let themselves feel about something, at least for now. He kept notes. Not many, but some. He noted each one. Elias looked at the envelopes. He didn't pick them up. He noted them, he said. Not a question. The date received. The return address. She paused. He wrote disposed of next to each one, like they were invoices he'd settled. The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret, don't, she said quickly. Don't say you're sorry. Don't say anything careful. I've been sitting here since 3 in the morning, and I've already said everything careful to myself, and I don't need to hear it again. He closed his mouth. She stood up abruptly and went to the window and stood looking out at the discolored sky with her arms crossed and her back to him, and he could see the tension in her shoulders, the specific tension of a person holding something heavy and not yet sure if they're going to be able to put it down. He was my father, she said, and he sat at that table and watched me wait for 3 years and never said a word. She stopped. And then he told me you must have found someone else. He said some men just don't have it in them to come back. He said I should stop waiting because waiting was making me bitter. Elias said nothing. He didn't trust what might come out if he spoke. I wasn't wrong about all of it, she said, and there was something in her voice now that was worse than anger, a complicated, exhausted grief that had nowhere clean to go. I was becoming bitter. I was. But it wasn't because you hadn't written. It was because I believed no one was coming. She turned then and looked at him directly. And now I find out that someone was coming all along. Someone was writing, and my father, she stopped hard, was protecting you, Elias said carefully, in the way he thought was right. Don't defend him to me. I'm not defending him. I'm just, he tried to find the words. He was wrong. What he did was wrong. But I knew Howard Hale, and I don't think he was cruel. I think he looked at me and decided I wasn't good enough, and then he made sure you agreed with him, and he told himself that was love. Margaret looked at him for a long, unreadable moment. He was wrong, she said. Yes, Elias said, he was. About all of it. Yes. She turned back to the window. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten in the east, that pale gray that comes before dawn proper, and against it the reddish cast of the smoke on the western ridge was even more visible. We have to move the cattle, she said. We do. We're going to talk about the rest of this, but not today. All right. Today we work. She pushed off the window frame and turned back to the room with a posture that was, he thought, one of the most determined things he'd ever seen. Not the determination of someone who was fine, but the determination of someone who had decided that not being fine was not a reason to stop moving. I'll get Finn up and fed. You start saddling the horses. He stood. Margaret. She stopped. All 41, he said. I wrote 41. She held his gaze. I know, she said quietly. Then she went to wake up Finn. The cattle drive. If you could call moving 38 head across 2 miles of pasture a cattle drive, was exhausting, loud, and occasionally ridiculous. Three of the younger steers kept deciding that any direction other than the one being indicated was the correct direction. And at one point, a particular brown and white cow, who had apparently made peace with dying exactly where she stood, had to be personally persuaded to move by Margaret, who approached her from three sides with a patience that Elias recognized as the specific patience of a person who had dealt with this particular animal many times before. Finn watched from the fence rail near the barn, as instructed. He watched with complete concentration, as though he'd been given responsibility for something important and intended to execute it with full professionalism. Every few minutes he would call out a helpful observation, "That one went left, Dad," or "She's going the wrong way." That was not technically useful, but had the effect of making both adults less grim about the whole enterprise. By midday, they had the herd in the north pasture, with the gate secured, and both of them were standing by the water trough, with the specific bonelessness that comes after sustained physical effort in heat. "That brown cow," Elias said. "Josephine," Margaret said. "She have a grudge against me specifically, or is that just her general position on life?" "General position." Margaret pushed her hat back and wiped her forehead with her sleeve. "She's been that way for 4 years. Robert used to say she was the most expensive cow on the property because of how much time she cost in arguing with her." It was the most naturally she'd spoken about Robert since Elias had arrived. He noticed it and didn't point it out, just let it sit there the way you let something fragile sit, without touching it, just making sure there was room for it. "Where's Finn?" Margaret said, looking toward the barn. "He was on the fence rail." "He's not there now." They both looked. The fence rail was empty. Elias scanned the yard, the barn entrance, the side of the house, and felt the particular cold spike of parental alarm that doesn't diminish no matter how many times it turns out to be nothing. "Finn!" he called. A small voice came from inside the barn. "In here!" They found him in the third stall, sitting cross-legged in the hay next to the black cattle dog, Bess, who was lying with her head in his lap looking deeply satisfied with this arrangement. Finn was telling her something in a low, serious voice, some kind of narrative involving rocks and horses, and a bad man, as far as Elias could make out, and paused to look up when they appeared in the doorway. "She was hot," Finn said. "I gave her water." Margaret looked at the tin water dish, which Finn had evidently found and filled from somewhere, sitting next to Bess's nose. The dog thumped her tail without lifting her head. "That was good thinking," Margaret said. Finn looked at her with the evaluating expression of someone checking whether the praise was genuine. Decided it was. "She likes me," he said. "She does," Margaret agreed. "She doesn't like most people." "I know." He said this with a quiet satisfaction. "She told me." Margaret glanced at Elias. He was already looking at the barn ceiling, keeping his face neutral. "Come on out when you're ready," Margaret said to Finn. "Lunch in 20 minutes." They walked back to the house side by side. After a moment, Margaret said, "He's a good boy." "He is," Elias said. "He's also spent the last year and a half mostly around adults. He talks to animals the same way he talks to people. I've given up trying to explain the distinction." "He's not wrong that Bess doesn't like most people," Margaret said. "She growled at Carl Briggs for the first 3 months he worked here." "She sat down for me at the gate," Elias said. "I noticed that." A pause. "I almost didn't let you in anyway." "I know." "I was close," she said. "I want you to understand that. I stood there with the rifle, and I was very close to just pointing back down the road." "What stopped you?" She was quiet for a moment, and he expected her to say it was Finn, the child, the obvious answer. And he would have accepted that. It was probably true. But instead she said quietly, and with some difficulty, like someone admitting to a thing they're not entirely comfortable admitting to, "You looked exactly the same. That's what stopped me. You looked tired and older and like you'd been through something terrible, but underneath all of that, you looked exactly the same." She paused, "And it made me angry, and I let you in because of the anger, because I wanted to know why." Elias walked beside her and didn't say anything. "Now I know why," she said. "Do you wish you'd sent me back down the road?" She considered this with genuine seriousness, not dismissing it. "Ask me again in a month," she said. He almost smiled. "All right." The afternoon brought Carl Briggs earlier than expected. He'd heard about the fire from a neighbor on the county road and driven out to see if he could help. I was the kind of man who communicated primarily through actions rather than words, and he arrived already knowing what needed doing, which was check the fire breaks on the south property line, assess the water situation for emergency use, and ride the fence on the north pasture that now held all 38 head of cattle. While Carl worked the south line, Elias and Margaret spent the afternoon on preparations that were less about the ranch and more about what they might need to take if the fire came to them. This conversation was practical and difficult at the same time because it required making decisions about what could be replaced and what could not, which is another way of asking what matters and what doesn't, which is rarely a comfortable question. The deed and the bank papers, Elias said, and the account records. Those are in the fireproof box already, Margaret said. What else? She didn't answer right away. They were in the study, and she was standing in front of her husband's desk with her hand on the top drawer handle and a look on her face that he understood was about more than the practical problem. There are photographs, she said, of my parents, from when I was young, and Robert's. She stopped. He had a pocket watch that was his father's. I've kept it. Those go in the box too, Elias said. What else? There's a quilt in the cedar chest in the bedroom. My mother made it. She looked at him. I know it's not practical. We can get a quilt out, he said. We can get most things out if we have enough time. The question is what we take if we don't. She understood what he was really asking. She took a breath and answered it honestly. The box? The photographs? The watch. She paused. Finn's things. Something in him shifted at that, at her including Finn's things in the list of what mattered, but he kept his voice even. I'll put together a bag for him tonight. Keep it by the door. You think it's going to get that close? She said. I think we should be ready for it to get that close. The ranger said 3 days. That was yesterday. The wind changed last night. He looked at her steadily. Margaret, I need you to be thinking about this seriously. Not as a precaution, as a genuine possibility. She held his gaze. I am thinking about it seriously, she said. She stopped. Started differently. This house is all I have left of them. My mother and my father and Robert. Everything that was real about those years is in these walls. If this house burns, her voice didn't break exactly, but it found an edge. I don't know what I have left. Elias looked at her. He wanted to say something that was true and not hollow, something that recognized the actual weight of what she was carrying without minimizing it or wrapping it in the kind of reassurance that sounds like comfort and feels like nothing. You have Finn calling you Maggie, he said. You have 38 head in the north pasture. You have a well that works now. He paused. You have the deeds to 400 acres of land that nobody is burning. She looked at him for a long moment. And you? She said. And then, immediately, as if she hadn't meant to say it quite that directly, I mean, you're staying. You said you're not going anywhere. I meant it, he said. She nodded slowly, turned back to the desk. I'll sort the papers tonight, she said. You get Finn's bag ready. All right. She opened the drawer and started pulling out folders, and he left her to it. Dinner that evening was the three of them at the kitchen table, which had become the default arrangement sometime in the second week without anyone formally deciding it. Finn ate with the focused efficiency of a child who has learned that food is not always reliable and should therefore be treated with appropriate respect. Margaret had made a proper meal, stew with biscuits, which she did without any ceremony, as though it were simply the thing that needed to happen rather than something that required acknowledgement. Carl says the fire's bigger than they thought, Finn said. Both adults looked at him. I heard him telling you, Finn said to Elias unapologetically. By the barn. You were supposed to be keeping water for Bess, Elias said. I was. I can hear while I do that. Margaret set her spoon down. She looked at Finn with the serious, direct attention she gave to things that mattered. It's a big fire, she said, up in the mountains. We're watching it. Will it come here? We don't know yet. What happens if it does? We leave, she said. We take what we need and we leave and we come back when it's safe. Finn considered this with his particular gravity. Then, what about Bess? Bess comes with us, Margaret said without hesitation. Finn seemed satisfied. He picked up his spoon and went back to his stew. After a moment he said, without looking up, I don't want to leave. Neither do I, Margaret said. But if we have to, Finn said, and now he looked up, a addressing both of them with the directness of someone who hasn't yet learned to disguise practical questions as something more comfortable. We go together? The question landed in the room and just sat there. Elias looked at Finn, then at Margaret. Margaret was looking at Finn, and the expression on her face was something Elias had not seen there before. Not the managed, effortful composure of someone holding themselves carefully, but something quieter and more involuntary than that. Something that had come up before she could think about whether to let it. "Yes," she said. "We go together." Finn nodded, finished his stew. After dinner, while Finn was in the side room with Bess and a collection of rocks he'd decided to organize by size, Elias and Margaret washed up at the basin in the near silence that had become their comfortable mode. At some point, the shoulder of her flannel shirt touched his arm, and neither of them moved away from it, and neither of them said anything about it, and that not saying was its own kind of statement. "I want to tell you something," she said, looking at the basin. "All right." "When I married Robert," she rinsed a plate, set it down. "I told myself I was being practical, that love was something that grew over time, that what I'd felt for you was just," she shook her head, "youth, immaturity, something you get over." "Did you get over it?" A pause. "I got around it," she said, "which is different." He didn't push further. He dried the plate she handed him, and then the next one, and they finished the washing up and put the clean dishes away. And the whole time, the smoke on the ridge was getting thicker, and the air through the kitchen window had that particular dry, heavy quality that people who have lived in fire country know to take seriously. Later, after Finn was in bed and Margaret had gone to finish sorting the papers in the study, Elias sat on the front porch with his coffee and watched the western sky. The reddish glow was more visible now, not dramatic but persistent, the kind of light that has no business being in a sky at this hour. Carl Briggs had told him, quietly and without alarm, when they were alone by the barn, that two of the ranches further west, the Dutton place and the old Hennessy operation, had already begun evacuating. Not because the fire was immediately on them, but because experienced people who have lived with fire don't wait until they can see the flames to start moving. Elias had nodded. He hadn't told Margaret that part yet. He was trying to find the right moment, which was probably a mistake, because there's rarely a right moment for that kind of news. There's just the news. He heard the screen door and looked up. Margaret came out with her own coffee and sat in the other chair. She looked at the sky. "The Dutton place," she said. He looked at her. "Carl told me when you were checking the north fence," she said, "and the Hennessy ranch. You knew already." "Since this afternoon." She drank her coffee. "I was deciding how to tell you, which I realize is exactly what you were doing." He almost laughed. "Yes." "We're both terrible at bad news," she said. "I'm fine at bad news," he said. "I just don't like giving it to someone who already has a lot of it." She looked at him sideways. "Is that consideration or is it paternalism?" He thought about it honestly. "Probably some of both." "At least you know," she said. They sat looking at the wrong sky. After a while, Margaret said, "The Dutton place is 12 miles from here." 11, he said, "and the fire is moving." "Yes." "So we might have less than 3 days." "We might." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you not telling me?" He looked at her. "Nothing. That's everything I have." "Elias." "Margaret, I promise you, that's everything." She studied him the way she studied everything, thoroughly, without rushing, and apparently found him credible because she turned back to the sky. "I rode this ranch every day for 2 years alone," she said, "after Robert died. Every morning before sunrise. I'd come out here and think, I've kept this place running, me, on my own." She paused. "I need you to know that. I know it," he said. "Anyone can see it. Because when this fire comes, and I hear you that it's when, not if, I'm not going to fall apart. I'm going to be useful. I need you to know that about me." "I do know it," he said, and he meant it completely. "I haven't thought otherwise for a single day." She looked at him steadily. "All right," she said. They finished their coffee. The stars that were visible in the eastern sky were bright and indifferent. The glow in the west was the opposite of stars. It was light that meant destruction rather than distance, and it was getting, almost imperceptibly, brighter. "Come inside," Margaret said, standing. "You need sleep. We both do." "In a minute." She paused. He expected her to go in. Instead, she stood beside his chair for a moment, and then she put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Just once, just lightly, the way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to touch, and then took it away and went inside without saying anything. He sat on the porch in the dark. He put his hand over the place on his shoulder where hers had been, and he stayed there a while longer, looking at the burning sky, and thought that the world had a particular talent for making things complicated in exactly the direction you most needed them to be simple. He also thought that there was something to be said for complicated. Then he went inside. The next morning, Carl Briggs arrived at first light with news that removed whatever was left of the comfortable assumption of time. The fire had jumped the second ridge overnight. The wind, which had been coming steadily from the west, had doubled in speed before dawn and pushed the fire through a section of dry forest that should have slowed it but didn't. The Forest Service was advising mandatory evacuation for the Upper Valley ranches within 24 hours and voluntary evacuation for the Lower Valley properties, which included the Hale Ranch, within 36. Carl delivered this information standing at the kitchen table, hat in hand, looking at the floor while he spoke with the manner of a man who has had to deliver bad news before and knows that the only decent way to do it is directly. Finn was still in the side room. Elias had heard him wake up, but he hadn't come out yet, which meant he was listening. "Voluntary?" Margaret said. "Yes, ma'am. Voluntary for now." "What's their projection for mandatory?" "If the wind holds," Carl said, "by tomorrow evening." Margaret looked at Elias. He looked back. Neither of them said anything, but the look was a conversation. Rapid, compressed, communicating in the shorthand that develops between people who have been working alongside each other in close quarters for long enough that words start to become redundant. "We start today," she said. "What do you need me on?" Carl said. "The horses. Get every horse we have to the north end of the property where the Gallatin Road runs. If we need to move fast, we move them out that way." She turned to Elias. "The cattle? I'll open the south gate," he said. "Let them work north on their own. They'll follow the grass and the water smell. We can guide them on horseback once we know which way we're going." She nodded. "The things in the house, box first, then the photographs, then anything else we can load in 20 minutes. "The quilt," she said. "The quilt," he agreed. Carl put his hat back on. "I'll get to the horses." After he left, Elias went to the side room doorway. Finn was sitting on the cot, dressed. He'd put his clothes on already, which meant he'd heard Carl's voice and started preparing himself. His boots were on, and his small canvas bag, the one Elias had packed 2 nights ago, was in his lap. He was holding it with both hands. Elias sat on the edge of the cot beside him. "You okay, buddy?" Finn looked up. His face was the serious, calibrated face he wore when he was trying to understand something adult and not complain about it. "Is it coming?" "Getting closer. Closer. We're going to be ready for it." "Ready means leaving?" "It might, for a while." Finn looked at the bag in his lap. "I put Mama's picture in here," he said. "The one from your coat." Elias went still for a second. He'd forgotten he'd put Ruth's photograph in his coat pocket months ago, for the road. Apparently Finn had found it and kept it. "That was smart," Elias said. "I didn't want it to burn," Finn said simply. Elias put his arm around his son's shoulders, and Finn leaned into him without ceremony, the way kids do when they're scared and trying not to show it, just pressing their weight against you and calling it something else. "We're not going to let anything burn that we can help," Elias said. "And whatever does burn, we'll still have each other. That's what matters." "And Maggie," Finn said. Elias looked at the top of his son's head. "Yeah," he said. "And Maggie." Finn sat up straighter, adjusted the bag in his lap, and stood up. "Okay," he said. "I'm ready." And looking at his 3-year-old son standing in his boots with his bag packed and his face set with that particular small, fierce readiness, Elias felt something he had no clean word for, a feeling that sat at the exact intersection of grief and pride and something else, something he would not name out loud yet because it was too new and too important to risk putting into words before he was sure it would hold. He stood up too. "Let's go," he said. The rest of the morning was controlled motion. The kind that happens when practical people with clear tasks are working under time pressure and there is too much to do and not enough of everything except urgency. Carl took the horses north, Elias opened the south gate, and he and Margaret spent an hour on horseback pushing the herd in the right direction which the cattle were at least partially cooperative about, since they could smell the smoke too now and had their own opinions about it. By mid-afternoon, the fireproof box was in the wagon. The photographs were wrapped in Margaret's spare blanket. The quilt from the cedar chest was rolled tight and tied with rope, and sitting in the wagon bed alongside 3 days of food and water and Finn's bag and Bess, who had climbed into the wagon without being asked and was sitting in the corner looking alert and alert. The whole valley smelled like smoke now, not the faint background smell of the past few days. This was close enough that you could feel it in the back of your throat, and the southern sky, when you looked at it, had a brown-orange tinge that meant the fire had crested something significant and was looking down at lower ground. Margaret stood at the porch steps with her hand on the rail, looking at the house. Elias came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He let her look. "My mother's kitchen table is in there," she said. "I know." "The rocking chair." "I know." "Robert's books." She stopped. "I can't carry all of it." "No." She took a breath, held it, let it out. "I know that," she said. "I know that already. I just needed to—" She stopped. "Say it out loud," he said. "Yeah, I know." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were dry, but there was something in them that was very close to the surface, working hard to stay where it was. "Do you think it'll hold?" she said. "The house?" He looked at it. Stone foundation. Good timber. The fire break they'd worked on along the south edge cleared ground and turned earth that he and Carl had spent a day on 3 days ago. "I don't know," he said honestly. "The fire break gives it a chance. The stone will hold longer than wood, but I don't know." She nodded. "All right." She took her hand off the rail. "Let's go." "Margaret." She stopped. "We're coming back," he said. "That's not a promise about the house. That's a promise about us. We come back and we see what's standing, and we figure out what's next from there. But we come back." She looked at him for a moment that held more in it than either of them was quite ready to put into words. Then she said, "You and your 41 letters," quietly, in a voice that wasn't quite steady, and walked past him to the wagon. He stood on the porch steps for one more moment, looked at the house, the windmill turning, the valley that was starting to fill with smoke at the far end. Then he turned and walked to the wagon and climbed up and picked up the reins, and Margaret was beside him, and Finn was in the back with his bag and Bess, and Carl was ahead on his horse, and the wagon started to move. None of them looked back. Or maybe they all did, once, quickly, and then looked forward again, which is the only honest way to leave something you're not sure you're going to see again. They made it to the Gallatin Road as the first real wall of smoke hit the valley floor. Not the thin, background presence that had been building for days. This was different in kind, a rolling brown-gray mass that moved with the wind like something alive and intentional, swallowing the tree line on the southern ridge as they watched from the wagon seat. The temperature had jumped 10 degrees in the last hour. The air tasted like char. Carl Briggs was riding ahead, keeping the horses moving north along the road where other wagons were already visible. The Pritchard family from the next property east, their wagon loaded high, and their 2 teenage boys riding alongside on mules. An older couple Elias didn't recognize, moving slowly in a buckboard pulled by a single draft horse that looked as tired as its owners. A man riding alone at a hard pace who didn't stop or look sideways. The Gallatin Road ran north along the valley floor for 8 miles before it met the main county road that led to Carswell, the nearest town with enough buildings and water capacity to serve as a staging point for displaced families. Elias had been on this road before, years ago, in different circumstances and a different life, and its familiarity now had a strange doubling quality. The road he remembered overlaid on the road he was traveling, neither quite canceling the other out. Finn was quiet in the wagon bed. That was unusual enough that Elias checked on him every few minutes, turning in the seat. Each time Finn was sitting with his back against the sideboard, his bag between his feet, one hand resting on Bess's back. He was watching the smoke, not with the detached curiosity he gave to most new things, but with the focused, worried attention of a child who understands something real is happening and is trying to figure out the size of it. Margaret was beside Elias on the wagon seat, and she had been largely silent since they pulled away from the house. Not the comfortable silence of their evening porches. This was the silence of someone processing, running calculations, making and unmaking decisions. He could feel it coming off her in the way you feel weather changing. They were 2 miles up the road when she said, "Stop the wagon." He looked at her. "Elias, stop." He pulled the reins. The wagon came to a halt. Carl, 20 yards ahead, looked back over his shoulder. "The Garfield family," Margaret said. "What about them?" "Their place is a mile south of ours. Ada Garfield has 3 children and her husband broke his leg 2 weeks ago. He can barely walk." Elias looked at her. Then he looked at the smoke behind them. The wall of it had advanced noticeably in the time they'd been on the road. It was closer and thicker and moving with the wind in a way that suggested the wind was not planning to slow down. "Margaret, I know where they'll be," she said. "Their wagon is old. If Frank can't get around, there's no one to hitch it." She was already standing on the seat, steadying herself with a hand on his shoulder. "Turn us around." "We can send someone from the road." "Who? There's nobody on this road who has time." She looked at him with an expression that was not asking. "Elias, Ada has a 7-year-old and twin girls who are 5. He sat there for exactly 3 seconds. He spent those 3 seconds looking at the smoke and looking at Margaret and doing the math. And the math was not comfortable, but it was clear. "Carl," he called. Carl turned his horse around and came back. "Take Finn," Elias said. "Keep him on the Gallatin Road and don't stop for anything. Get to Carswell and wait at the Broadhurst livery. You know it?" "I know it," Carl said. "Finn." Elias turned. His son was already on his feet in the wagon bed, having understood from the tone of voices that something was changing. "You're going with Carl." Finn's eyes moved from Elias to Margaret and back. "You're going back," he said, "for a little while, to help someone." "I want to come." "I know you do, but Carl needs someone to keep him from getting lost." Finn looked at Carl Briggs, who was a 60-year-old man who had lived in this valley for 30 years and was visibly not lost. Then Finn looked back at his father. He knew when he was being managed. He also knew, apparently, when the managing was necessary, because after a moment he picked up his bag and held out his arms. Elias lifted him out of the wagon and up to Carl, who settled the boy in front of him on the horse with a competence that suggested he'd done it before. Finn got a grip on the saddle horn and looked down. "Bess," he said. Margaret had already picked up the dog and handed her up to Carl. Bess tolerated this with dignity. "Go straight north," Elias said to Carl. "Don't slow down." Carl nodded. He looked at the smoke and then at Elias and then at Margaret, with the expression of a man who has seen enough of life to know when other people are making decisions that are both probably foolish and completely unavoidable. "Livery on the east end of Maine," Carl said. "I'll be there." He turned the horse and rode north. Finn looked back once, his small face serious and white, and raised one hand. Elias raised his back. Then he turned the wagon south. "How sure are you about their wagon?" he said. "Almost certain," Margaret said. She dropped back to the seat and was gripping the board as he pushed the horses faster than was comfortable on the road. "It's old. Frank bought it secondhand 3 years ago, and it's been giving trouble since. If he can't get around to hitch the team and load it—" "What's their team?" "2 mares, old ones. They're in the paddock behind the house, not the barn." Behind them, the road stretched back toward home, and beyond it the smoke was a ceiling now, not just a wall. It had spread horizontally and was dimming the afternoon light in a way that made the whole landscape look like late evening, even though it was barely 3 o'clock. The Garfield property came into view just as the first flickers of orange became visible above the southern tree line. Not the fire itself, not yet, but the light of it reflecting off the lowest layer of smoke, the fire's announcement of itself before it arrived in person. Ada Garfield was in the yard when they came through the gate. She was a small, practical woman in her mid-30s who Elias had seen once ever spoken to, and she was moving at a controlled run between the house and an old wagon that was sitting unhitched in the middle of the yard with what appeared to be a random assortment of household items piled in it with no particular logic. Her 3 children were arranged around the yard in various states of helpful but not helping. The 7-year-old boy trying to back one of the mares toward the wagon tongue. The twin girls carrying things out of the house that were probably not the most essential things, but were the things they'd been sent for. Ada turned when she heard the wagon, and the expression on her face was a specific mix of relief and shame that Elias recognized. The expression of someone who has been trying to manage alone and has just been caught not managing. Margaret, she said, where's Frank? Inside. He tried to get up this morning and fell. I don't think the leg is setting right. He's in too much pain to. She stopped, looked at the sky. I can't get the harness on by myself. I've tried 3 times. Elias, Margaret said. He was already out of the wagon. The mares were the problem. Not the harness, which was old but serviceable, but the mares themselves, who were picking up on the smoke and the anxiety in the yard and expressing their opinion about all of it through their feet and ears. Elias spent 6 minutes talking to the nearer mare in the low, continuous way his father had taught him, just sound and presence, not pulling or forcing, just being there until the horse decided he was not the thing to be afraid of. The mare was never fully calm. Nothing with a functioning nose was calm within 2 miles of that smoke, but she became controllable, which was enough. He got the harness on. He got the second mare hitched. He checked the traces and the tongue and the brake with the speed of someone doing a thing they've done many times before, not thinking about the individual steps, but letting the body run through them while the mind stayed with the larger problem. Inside the house, he could hear Margaret and Ada. Margaret's voice, steady and directive. The medicine first. Is it on the table? Good. The papers in that box? Yes. Frank, can you tell me which drawer? And Frank Garfield's voice, lower and strained with pain. The left one. The blue tin. No, the other blue. The 7-year-old came and stood near Elias while he worked. His name, Elias would learn later, was Will, and he was the kind of boy who believed that if he stood near enough to a competent adult and watched hard enough, the competence might transfer. Is it going to burn? Will said. Elias checked the left trace. We're going to leave before it gets here. But the house. Is the house going to burn? He straightened and looked at the boy. Will was holding himself very still in the particular way of children trying to be old enough for whatever is happening. I don't know, Elias said. But things can be rebuilt. Can't rebuild people. He held the boy's eyes for a moment. You understand me? Will nodded briefly. Go help carry things out. Pick heavy things. Not the decorations. Heavy things. Food, blankets, tools. Will turned and ran for the house with the enthusiasm of someone who has been given a real job. It took 22 minutes to get the Garfield wagon loaded in a way that was organized rather than panicked. 22 minutes during which the orange light above the tree line became unmistakably fire-colored, and the wind pushed a shower of ash across the yard that landed on everything like dirty snow. Margaret helped Frank Garfield from the house to the wagon seat, which was a slow and painful process that Frank bore with the grim silence of a man who has decided that complaining costs time he doesn't have. Ada loaded the children into the wagon bed with the efficiency of someone who has stopped thinking about what she's leaving behind and is thinking only about what she's taking with her. Go straight north on the Gallatin, Elias said, standing by the Garfield wagon. Don't turn off. Don't slow down for anything you see on the road. If the horses balk, Ada, you and Will get out and lead them. They'll move faster led than driven if they're scared. Ada looked at him from the wagon seat. Are you coming right behind us? Yes, Margaret said, climbing back onto their wagon. Right behind. The Garfields moved out through the gate and turned north. Elias got back on the seat and turned the wagon to follow. He was 50 yards out of the Garfield gate when Margaret said, Wait. He looked at her. Her face was doing something complex and effortful. She was looking back toward the south, toward where their property lay, and her expression had the specific quality of someone fighting with themselves about something they already know the answer to. There's something I left, she said. The box is in the wagon. Not the box? He waited. My mother's Bible, she said. I know I said no religion. I know, but it's not. She stopped. It was hers. She kept it her whole life, and she wrote all our names in the front. Every birthday. She shook her head. I meant to pack it. I had it in my hand, and then Finn needed something, and I put it on the kitchen table, and I forgot. Margaret, I know, she said quickly. I know we can't go back. I know that. He looked at the sky. The fire was over the southern ridge now. He could see it clearly, not just the reflection of it, but the actual leading edge. A line of orange moving through the dry timber with a speed that people who haven't seen fire move through drought-dried forest are generally not prepared for. The wind was pushing it. His experienced eye gave it 15 minutes before the south end of the valley was fully engaged. Maybe 20. Their ranch was a mile south of the Garfield place. He handed Margaret the reins. She looked at him. "Elias, keep these horses moving north," he said. "Don't stop. You hear me? Don't stop for anything. You are not going back there. I know where it is. Kitchen table. I'll be 10 minutes. The fire is on the ridge. I know where the fire is." He was already on the ground. "Margaret, take the reins." "This is insane," she said, but she took the reins because she was also practical, and she knew that the Garfields needed someone ahead of them, and Finn was already up the road, and someone had to keep moving. 10 minutes, he said. "Don't stop." He turned and ran. Running south while everything on the road was moving north was a particular experience. The smoke was dense enough now that his eyes were stinging before he'd covered a quarter mile, and the light had the underwater quality that comes when the sun is fully blocked, a false dusk that made distances hard to judge and turned familiar landscapes strange. He ran with his arm across his nose and mouth and kept his eyes on the road because the road was what he knew. The ranch came into sight through the smoke with a quality that was almost dreamlike. The house still standing, the windmill still turning, the near pasture fence still straight. It looked from a distance and through the haze almost normal. The fire was in the southern tree line, visible over the roof line, close enough that he could hear it now. A sound he'd heard before and never quite gotten comfortable with. A low roar that was less like burning than like something very large breathing. He went through the front door. The house was full of smoke, but not yet on fire. The air inside was thick and hot and carried the smell of the outside disaster. He went directly to the kitchen. The Bible was on the table where Margaret had said, a small brown leather volume with the cover worn soft from decades of hands. He grabbed it. He was turning to leave when he saw the photograph on the shelf by the door. He'd walked past it every day for 3 weeks and registered it without focusing on it. Now, with the house full of smoke and time doing something strange and accelerated, he looked at it properly for the first time. A young woman in a formal dress, seated. A man standing beside her with one hand on her shoulder. The photograph had the formality of the period. Serious expressions, stiff poses. But the woman's eyes were unmistakably Margaret's, and the man's hand on her shoulder had a particular quality to it, a gentleness in the tension of the fingers, that made it clear this was not just a posed portrait. This was someone's parents, and someone had loved them. He took it off the shelf. He went back out the front door, and the fire was closer than it had been, and the sound of it was louder, and the air was hot enough to feel against his skin. He ran north. He ran with the Bible in one hand and the photograph in the other, and ash falling around him like gray snow and the roar of the fire growing behind him with every step. And he thought, as clearly as he'd ever thought anything, that he was not going to let this particular story end here. Not after 41 letters and 12 years and a 3-year-old boy who had packed his dead mother's photograph because he didn't want it to burn. Not after Margaret at the gate with a rifle and Margaret at the table with the ledger and Margaret's hand on his shoulder in the dark. He ran. At the halfway point, he looked back once and saw that the south end of the valley was fully alight. Not the edge of the fire, but the fire itself. In the pasture and moving through the dry grass with the terrible efficiency of something encountering no resistance. The fire break they'd built along the south property line was doing something. He could see where the fire was being slowed, forced to find another angle. But he had no way to know yet whether it would hold. He looked forward again and kept running. Margaret had not gone far. She'd made it perhaps 300 yards up the road before she'd stopped the wagon. He could see her from half a mile away. The wagon pulled off to the side, her standing on the seat with one hand shielding her eyes, looking back. When she saw him running toward her through the smoke, something in her posture changed in a way that was visible even at that distance, a release of something that had been held extremely tight. He reached the wagon and put both hands on the sideboard and bent over, catching his breath. She dropped to her knees on the seat and took his face in her hands, which startled him enough that he looked up. And she was examining him with an intensity that was partly practical, checking for burns, checking for injury, and partly something else that she wasn't trying to categorize at the moment. "You are the most," she started, and stopped, and started differently. "Are you burned?" "No." "Are you sure?" "Your arm." Caught a branch. "It's nothing." He straightened up. He held up the Bible. Then he held up the photograph. He watched her face when she saw it. The photograph she hadn't packed, hadn't thought to ask for, hadn't expected to see again. She took the photograph with both hands. She looked at it for 2 seconds. That was all she permitted herself. 2 seconds, and then she took a breath and pressed it against her chest and said, "Get on the wagon." He got on the wagon. She handed him the reins and he turned the horses north and pushed them as fast as they'd go, and neither of them said anything for a full minute. The fire's sound was audible from the road now, a constant presence behind them. "You went back for a photograph," she said finally. Not accusatory, not even surprised, quite. More like someone noting in fact that doesn't fit neatly into any category they have ready. "You didn't ask for it," he said, "but you would have." "How did you know I hadn't packed it?" "It was sitting right next to the window where the light is best," he said. "You look at it in the mornings." She looked at him. "I notice things," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You could have been killed." "I wasn't." "Elias." Her voice had dropped into that register again, the one she used when she meant something more than the words were carrying. "I need you to understand that I was not going to be—" She stopped. "I was standing on that wagon seat, and I was—" She stopped again, tried again. "I need you to come back. When you go somewhere, I need you to come back. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The wagon hit a rough patch in the road, and he steadied the horses and steadied his voice. "Yes," he said, "I understand." "Because I have done the other version," she said, and her voice was precise and careful and slightly unsteady at the same time, like someone carrying something breakable over uncertain ground. "I have done the version where someone leaves and doesn't come back, and I am not doing that version again." He looked at her sideways, and she was looking at the road ahead, and her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright. "Margaret," he said. "Don't say anything careful," she said. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I said it before, and I'll keep saying it until you believe it." She didn't answer, but she moved on the seat until her shoulder was against his, and she stayed there, and he did not move away, and they drove north with the fire behind them and the road ahead, and the sound of the burning valley growing fainter with every mile. They reached the Gallatin Road junction as the light was beginning its strange, fire-dimmed version of evening. Other families were moving along the main road, more than Elias had expected. A loose procession of wagons and horses and people on foot, carrying what they'd managed to bring, all of them moving with the particular focused silence of people who have left something behind and not yet arrived anywhere. Carl Briggs was exactly where he'd said he'd be. At the junction, not at Carswell yet, because he'd waited. I was sitting on his horse with Finn in front of him and Bess on the ground beside the horse's feet. And when Elias's wagon came up the road, Finn turned on the horse and said nothing, just held out both arms. Elias stopped the wagon and lifted his son off the horse and held him for a moment, and Finn wrapped his arms around his neck and held on with the grip of someone who has been managing their worry for an hour and is now allowing themselves to be done managing it. "You smell like smoke," Finn said into his shoulder. "Yeah. The fire's behind you." "It is." "Is it out?" "Not yet, but we're ahead of it." Finn pulled back and looked at him with that direct, evaluating look. "You went back," he said, "for some things." Finn looked at Margaret, who had come around the wagon and was standing near Carl's horse. He looked at her for a moment with the specific, unguarded assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise what he's looking for. Then he held out one arm toward her, keeping the other around Elias's neck. Margaret stepped forward without hesitation and put her arm around Finn's small shoulders, and for a moment the three of them were standing in the road in the wrong-colored light, with ash in the air and the sound of the fire behind them. And it was not a comfortable moment or a clean one, but it was real in a way that very few moments are. Bess leaned against Margaret's leg. Carl Briggs looked at the sky and at the road and at his boots, giving them what privacy the middle of a public road would allow. "Carswell," Elias said finally. "Carswell," Margaret agreed and stepped back and adjusted the photograph she'd been holding this whole time. Carl fell in alongside the wagon, and they joined the procession of displaced families moving north. Finn rode on Elias's lap on the wagon seat, which was not quite regulation but was clearly necessary, and Bess had gotten back into the wagon bed and was sitting with her nose raised, reading the air. An hour up the road they came alongside the Garfield wagon, moving at the same pace. Ada Garfield turned on the seat and saw them, and her face changed. Frank, from inside the wagon, called out something Elias couldn't make out. "They're fine," Margaret called back. "Everybody's fine." Ada nodded. She looked at the road ahead and then back at Margaret. "The Hendersons," she said. "I didn't see them on the road." "The Hendersons are 6 miles east," Margaret said. "The fire went south-southwest. They should be clear." Ada nodded again, accepting this. She turned back to her horses. As their wagons moved alongside each other in the dim, smoke-filtered light, Elias thought about the nature of a valley, how everything in it is connected in ways that aren't always visible until something goes wrong. The same water table, the same grass, the same road out. You could spend years on your own property, managing your own concerns, and believe yourself separate from everyone around you, and then a fire comes and reveals that you were never separate at all. You were always part of the same thing, you just hadn't needed to know it yet. He thought about Margaret saying, "We go together." He thought about Finn's arm reaching toward her in the road. I thought about 41 letters and 12 years of silence, and a decision a dead man had made at a mailbox on a county road, and all the ways a life can be diverted from its intended course by a single person's certainty that they know best. He thought that he had spent 12 years believing himself abandoned, and Margaret had spent 12 years believing herself left, and neither of them had done anything to deserve any of it. And there was no amount of understanding Howard Hale's fear or his love or his misguided protection that made any of that easier to sit with. But he also thought they were both still here. They were still on the same road. That had to count for something. He was not yet sure how much, and he suspected Margaret wasn't either. And that uncertainty was uncomfortable in the way that all true things are uncomfortable when you can't yet see their shape completely. But it was there. Whatever it was. It was there. The lights of Carswell appeared on the horizon just as full dark came down, and with the dark came a shift in the wind, subtle but real. The kind of change that people who have been watching the weather closely all day feel in their skin before they understand it in their minds. Elias felt it and looked up and looked west and said nothing. Carl, riding beside the wagon, looked up too. He looked at Elias. "Could be," Carl said. Just those 2 words. "Yeah," Elias said. "Could be." Finn was asleep against his chest by then, one hand twisted in the fabric of Elias's shirt, his face slack and entirely trusting in the way that sleeping children's faces are, with no guard up against anything, just completely surrendered to the assumption that the adults around them will manage the world well enough to make morning possible. Elias felt the wind on his face. Margaret, beside him, felt it too. She raised her face to it with her eyes closed for a moment, like someone listening to something being said very quietly from a very long distance. "Is that?" she said. "Don't say it yet," he said. "Let's see." She lowered her face and looked at the road. He looked at the road. The wagon moved forward into the lights of Carswell, carrying everything they had managed to save and leaving behind everything they hadn't, and somewhere behind them in the burning valley, the wind was turning and asking the fire a question neither of them could yet hear the answer to. They pulled into the Broadhurst livery yard as the first scattered drops of rain came down, tentative and almost apologetic, the way rain comes when it knows it's late. The rain that had started as a tentative suggestion became something serious by midnight. Elias heard it change, heard the shift from the scattered, uncertain drops that had followed them into Carswell to a steady, purposeful fall that drummed on the livery roof with the kind of authority that meant it intended to stay. He was lying on a cot in the corner of the Broadhurst livery's back room, which was where the liveryman, a wide man named Ed Broadhurst, had set up what he called accommodations, and what was more honestly a cleared space with borrowed bedding and a lamp. There were 4 other families in the main livery area: the Garfields, an elderly couple named Sutton, a young woman traveling alone with an infant who hadn't said her name to anyone, and a rancher from further west named Beaumont who had gotten out with nothing except his horse and the clothes he was wearing and seemed to be still processing this fact in real time. Finn was asleep on the cot beside Elias, turned on his side with one arm over Bess, who had made herself into a compact, warm shape against the boy's stomach, and was radiating the peaceful certainty of an animal who considers any dry surface with a cooperative human to be an acceptable arrangement. Elias lay on his back looking at the roof beams and listening to the rain and trying to decide whether it was enough. He heard Margaret get up. She was on a cot on the other side of Finn. They had arranged themselves this way without discussion, Finn between them, which was where Finn had placed himself by simply lying down in the middle and leaving no room for alternative configurations. Elias heard the specific sound of her sitting up, the creak of the cot, and then the soft movement of her feet on the floor. He sat up too. She was standing near the narrow window in the back wall, looking out at the dark. The rain was visible against the lamplight from the main livery. Not the fire-colored light of the past 2 days, but ordinary yellow lamplight, the domestic, manageable kind. He got up and came and stood beside her. Through the window, the sky to the south was dark. Not the wrong dark of smoke blocking the stars, but actual dark. The dark of a sky where the visible light had been taken away by clouds and rain rather than by fire. Whether that meant the fire was out or merely suppressed or simply hidden behind the weather, there was no way to know from here. "Can't tell," she said quietly, knowing what he was looking for without him saying it. "No." The ranger at the road said the rain was in the forecast. He said it might help. "Might," Elias said, "if it's heavy enough and lasts long enough." "It feels heavy." "It does." She crossed her arms over her chest, not the defensive posture of someone closing off, but the posture of someone cold, which was something else entirely, and he registered the difference. He'd left his coat on the peg by the cot, and he went and got it and brought it back and held it out. She looked at it for a moment, then took it and put it on without ceremony, pulling it around her shoulders. They stood at the window. After a while, Margaret said, "Tell me what happened." He looked at her sideways. "What part?" "The part you've never told me." She kept her eyes on the dark window. "You said you believed I'd chosen someone else, but you wrote for 3 years. You wrote 41 letters and got no answer, and you still kept writing. So at some point you stopped. At some point you believed it enough to stop. What happened?" He was quiet for a moment, listening to the rain. "I came back," he said. She turned to look at him then. "The spring of the 4th year," he said, "I'd saved enough. I had a job offer from a ranch outside Laramie. Good work, steady pay, somewhere there was room for something. I rode back to tell you." He looked at the window. "I got to the county road, down by the fence where the mailbox used to be, and there was a man there. I didn't recognize him at first." "My father," she said. It wasn't a question. "He was checking the mail. He saw me coming up the road and he walked out to the road and he stood there and he told me—" He stopped, started again. "He told me you'd gotten married 3 months prior. He said you were happy. He said you had a husband who was a good man and a settled life, and that I should leave well enough alone." Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word. "He said you'd stopped asking about letters a year ago," Elias said. "He said the kindest thing I could do was go away and let you have the life you'd built." He paused. He was very calm about it, very certain. He looked like a man who had already made his peace with the thing he was telling me. "Because he had," Margaret said, and her voice had the hollow quality of someone arriving at a conclusion they'd been moving toward and didn't want to reach. "He had 12 years to make his peace with it." "I believed him," Elias said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I stood there on that road and I believed him, because I'd been writing for 3 years with no answer, and the most reasonable explanation for that was the one he was giving me. That you'd moved on. That I'd waited too long to come back and someone else had been there and you'd made a life." He looked at his hands. "I told myself I was glad for you. I told myself that for about 2 years. Then I stopped telling myself anything about it because it didn't seem to help. And you never—" She stopped. "In 12 years you never tried to find out differently?" "I came close," he said. "Twice. But both times I talked myself out of it, because I'd heard it from your own father, and because—" He paused. "Because I think I was also protecting myself. From finding out that maybe it was both things. That maybe he'd kept the letters and you'd also been ready to move on." "I didn't want to know that." She was quiet. Outside the rain was steady and serious. "I was not ready to move on," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Robert was a decent man, and I was not unhappy with him, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I was not ready to move on. I married him because I thought you were gone, and I was 31 years old, and I was tired of waiting for something that—" She stopped. "That I thought wasn't coming." "Margaret, I'm not angry at you," she said. "I want you to hear that clearly. I was angry at you for years, but that was a different anger. It was about a story I had wrong, and I'm—" She took a breath. I'm working on putting it down. The anger. I'm not all the way there yet. You don't have to be. I know I don't have to be. I'm telling you where I am. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. And where I am is, I'm standing in a livery barn in Carswell at midnight listening to rain, and I don't know if my house is standing, and I am. She stopped. Her voice had developed a slight tremor that she was not entirely successfully concealing. I am very tired, Elias. I'm a very tired person. He turned toward her, and what he did was not grand or dramatic. He simply put his arm around her shoulders, the way you do with someone who is cold and exhausted and carrying more than they should be carrying alone, and she allowed it, which was its own thing, because Margaret allowing something she didn't have to allow was not a small gesture. She leaned against his shoulder for a moment. Just a moment. Then she straightened, but she didn't step away. Okay, she said, quietly. Okay. They stayed at the window until the rain convinced them it knew what it was doing, and then they went back to the cots and lay down in the dark with Finn, between them and Bess, a warm weight at the foot of the cot, and the livery full of the breathing of displaced families and horses, and the rain working steadily on the roof above them all. Elias was asleep before he expected to be. He dreamed about the fence. In the morning, the rain was still falling, lighter now, but persistent. The kind of rain that doesn't make dramatic claims, but simply stays and stays until it has done what it came to do. Ed Broadhurst's wife had made coffee and a vast quantity of cornbread and set it out in the main livery area, and the displaced families moved around it with the slightly dazed, overly courteous manner of people who have slept badly in unfamiliar places and are not yet sure how much of yesterday was real. Frank Garfield's leg was worse. He'd slept through the night, which was good, but when morning came he couldn't put any weight on it at all, and the swelling was bad enough that Ada, who was not a woman given to alarm, came and found Margaret and said quietly that she thought something might be broken properly rather than just badly. And Margaret went with her to look and came back and found Elias and said, "He needs a doctor." "Is there one in Carswell?" "Dr. Hewitt, 2 blocks east of here, on the main street." "Go get him," Elias said. "I'll stay with Finn." She went. The doctor came. The leg was broken in 2 places. Had been broken since the original fall, it turned out, though whether it had been made worse by the evacuation journey was uncertain and probably not something any of them wanted to calculate. Hewitt said it properly and said Frank Garfield was going to be off it for 8 weeks minimum, and that the next person who let him walk on it before then would have to answer to the doctor personally. Frank bore this news with the expressionless stoicism of a man who has run out of reactions. Ada sat beside him and held his hand and said nothing, and something in the efficiency of that gesture, the economy of it, the complete absence of performance, made Elias think about how long they must have been married, and what 12 years of watching a life go on without you actually meant when you got right down to it. He found Finn at mid-morning attempting to teach Bess a trick, involving a piece of Ed Broadhurst's cornbread and an elaborate system of commands that Bess was ignoring with dignified patience. "She already knows things," Finn said when Elias crouched beside him. "She's not interested in new things." "Bess is a working dog," Elias said. "She knows what she knows and she doesn't feel the need to add to it. That's stubborn, or just certain," Elias said. "There's a difference." Finn considered this. Then, "Is the house burned?" "We don't know yet." "When do we go back and look?" "When the road is safe." "How long is that?" "Today, maybe. Tomorrow, at the latest." Finn picked up the cornbread and ate it himself, a decision Bess watched with judgment, but no apparent surprise. "I want to go back," he said. "Me too," Elias said. "Does Maggie?" Elias looked across the livery to where Margaret was speaking with the ranger who had come in from the road, a different one from the day before, a younger man with a rain-soaked coat and the look of someone who had been up all night. And he watched the way she was standing, the way she leaned forward slightly when she was listening to something important, the way her hand went to the wall behind her when she heard something she wasn't expecting. "Yeah," he said, "she does." Margaret came back with the ranger's report, which was this. The rain had hit the valley hard enough, and the wind had cooperated enough, that the fire's southern advance had stalled through the night. The western sections were still burning in the upper elevations where the rain was lighter, but the valley floor, the lower ranches, the Gallatin Road corridor, had been spared the worst. Properties south of the hail line had sustained significant damage. Properties north of it were, as far as the ranger could determine from his overnight observation, largely intact. The hail property, Elias said. He doesn't know specifically, Margaret said. She was working hard to keep her voice level and mostly succeeding. He said the stone structures in that area of the valley appeared to be standing. He couldn't confirm the outbuildings. Stone structures, Elias said. The house foundation is stone. The main walls are stone to the window line. She paused. Robert insisted on it. He said if we were going to build in fire country, we were going to build right. Elias looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression that held, among other things, a complicated acknowledgement of the fact that a dead man's practical decision was possibly what had kept their house standing. Neither of them said anything about it. The road south is open, Elias said to the ranger. As of 2 hours ago, the ranger said. It's muddy, and there are sections where you'll need to be careful, but it's passable. Elias, Margaret said. We go this morning, he said. I was going to say the same thing, she said. They left Carswell at 9 o'clock, in the rain, with Finn on the seat between them and Bess in the wagon bed and Carl Briggs riding alongside looking at the sky with the expression of a man composing a list of things that needed doing and finding it longer than he'd like. The Gallatin Road was everything the ranger had promised. Deep ruts in the muddiest sections, standing water in the low areas. One place where a section of the bank had slid across the road during the night, and they had to navigate around it through the grass. But the horses managed it, and the wagon managed it, and by mid-morning they were on the county road that led into the valley. The valley looked like the day after something. That was the only way Elias could have put it. Not destroyed, not the ruin he'd been bracing himself for, but marked. Profoundly, and in ways that would take seasons to fully reckon. The southern tree line that had been dense timber was now a landscape of black standing trunks and gray ash, still smoking faintly in the rain. The grass in the southern pasture was gone, burned down to bare soil over what looked like a substantial area. The Dutton place, which they passed on the road, had lost its barn entirely. The main house was standing but scorched badly along one side, and the smell of it was something that didn't need any description. None of them spoke much. Finn, between the two adults on the wagon seat, looked at everything without comment. He had his bag in his lap. Still, after all of this, still carrying it, and he watched the changed valley with those dark, serious eyes that took everything in and gave very little back. They came around the last bend in the county road and saw the Hale Ranch. The main house was standing. Elias had known, from the ranger's report, that it was probably standing. He'd calculated it, assessed the stone construction and the fire break and the wind direction and the rain, and arrived at a probability. But knowing something probably and seeing it across a field in the gray morning rain were two entirely different experiences, and the sight of the house, battered, smoke-stained along the eastern wall, the porch railing gone on one side, but standing, structurally sound, its stone walls exactly where they had been, produced in him a feeling that he hadn't been prepared for and couldn't quickly name. He heard Margaret draw a breath beside him. That was all. Just the one breath. But it was a breath that had about 12 years of complicated history compressed into it, and it said everything that needed saying. The barn had taken damage. The north-facing wall was standing, but the roof had gone, collapsed inward, he could see as they got closer, probably from heat rather than direct fire. The small equipment shed was gone entirely, nothing left but a concrete pad and some twisted metal. The fence along the south pasture line, the fence he'd spent 9 days rebuilding, was damaged in sections but had held in the critical areas, and the fire break they'd cleared was visible as a scorched but effective line between the standing structures and the burned southern grass. Carl dismounted and walked the near perimeter without being asked, his face doing the particular economy of a man making mental calculations. Finn climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard looking at the house. Bess jumped down after him and walked to the porch steps and sat there, apparently considering the matter settled. Margaret got down from the wagon. She walked to the front porch, up the steps. She put her hand on the door frame. The door was still in place, slightly warped from the heat, but closed. And she stood there with her hand on the frame and her back to all of them, and Elias gave her that. He stayed by the wagon and gave her the moment without witnesses, or as close to that as you could get in a yard with 4 other people in it. After a while, she pushed the door open and went inside. Elias went to help Carl. The damage assessment took the better part of 2 hours and was the kind of work that keeps the mind occupied, which was exactly what was needed. The house. Sound, with smoke damage to the interior walls and ceiling in the kitchen and a broken window on the east side, but no structural compromise. The barn. The standing walls were solid. The roof was a total loss. The animals had been evacuated before the fire arrived, and so there was no animal loss to account for. The equipment shed, total loss, though the larger equipment had been moved out before they'd left. The south fence, repairable. The south pasture, 2 seasons of growth, minimum, before it would carry cattle again. Carl wrote a list on the back of an old receipt he found in his coat pocket. The list was long, but it had the character of a list of things to be done rather than a list of losses, which was a useful distinction. "The well is fine," Carl said. "Tested it this morning. Still running clean." "Good," Elias said. "That's the foundation of everything else." "The north pasture fence held. Cattle can go back as soon as—" "Not today," Elias said. "Let the ground settle. Tomorrow." Carl nodded. He looked at the barn. "I know a man in Deaver who does roofing work. Fair price and good timber. I can send word today." "Do that." They were standing by the collapsed barn roof, looking at the wreckage of it, when they heard Finn call from the porch. His voice was the specific pitch of a child who has found something and needs an adult to confirm whether the finding is significant. They came around to the front of the house. Finn was standing on the porch steps, and he was not alone. Margaret was in the doorway behind him, and she was holding something against her chest with both arms, and her face had the expression of someone who has just found something they had stopped expecting to see. "The kitchen table," she said. Elias looked. Through the open door he could see the interior, smoke-stained walls, a layer of ash on the floor that the rain had dampened into a dark paste, the disarray of a room that had been closed up and exposed to terrible heat, and in the middle of it, exactly where it had always been, her mother's kitchen table, solid and dark and perfectly intact. "Stone floors," Carl said quietly. "Stone walls. Stone holds the heat differently, doesn't feed it." Margaret looked at the table for another moment. Then she looked at Elias. "The rocking chair," she said. "Let's look," he said. The rocking chair was in the corner of the front room, and it was fine. The shelves along the east wall had warped from heat, and 2 of them had dropped, spilling their contents on the floor. But the chair itself had not even scorched. The cedar chest in the bedroom was closed and intact. When Margaret opened it, the quilt inside was untouched, which was when she finally sat down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands, not crying exactly, but doing whatever the thing is that's next door to crying, the thing that happens when you've held it together through the crisis and the evacuation and the night in the livery and the drive back and the damage assessment, and then the cedar chest is fine, and the quilt is fine, and suddenly there's nothing left to brace against. Elias sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, which was what was needed. After a minute, she lowered her hands. Her face was composed, but not distant, present and real, and not trying to be anything other than what it was. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you are." "I'm not, this isn't—" "Margaret, you don't have to explain it." She looked at him. Something moved in her face that was not quite a question and not quite a statement, but was in the territory between them. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right." "When you went back for the photograph," she said, "when I saw you coming back through the smoke, running," she stopped. "I want you to know what that was like. Standing on that wagon, watching you come back toward me through all of that." She paused. "Because I've been trying to figure out how to say it correctly, and I don't think there's a correct version, so I'm just going to say the honest one." "Okay," he said. "It was the first time in 12 years, she said carefully, that someone came back." The room was quiet around them. Outside, the rain was lighter now, dropping toward the kind of drizzle that comes at the end of something. Through the window, they could hear Carl moving around in the yard, and Finn's voice talking to Bess with the specificity of someone describing a situation in detail. Elias sat with what she'd said for a moment. He didn't rush past it or wrap it in something easier. "I'm going to keep coming back," he said. "I know that's what you intend." "Margaret," he turned to look at her directly. "I know you've heard promises before. I know you've lived on the wrong side of one for 12 years, and it's not a position that makes you trusting of the next one. I understand that. He held her eyes. I'm not asking you to trust the words. I'm asking you to watch the actions. Every day, watch what I do. And if at any point what I do doesn't match what I say, you tell me, and I'll answer for it. She looked at him steadily. The appraising look. The look that didn't give anything away before it was ready. That's a fair offer, she said finally. It's the only one I've got. A pause. Then she nodded, once, with the specific gravity of someone making a decision that has real weight to it. All right, she said. All right. They sat on the edge of the bed in the smoke-damaged bedroom with the intact quilt in the cedar chest beside them, and the sound of the rain on the stone walls, and the sound of Finn outside telling Bess something complicated about what had happened and what was going to happen next, explaining the world to the dog and the patient, detailed way he always did, leaving nothing out. After a while, they went back outside. The afternoon was given to the practical work of beginning, not restoration, that would take weeks and months, but the first gestures of it. Sweeping ash from the kitchen floor, opening windows to let the smoke smell move. Carl spent the afternoon clearing debris from the barn perimeter, and Elias worked alongside him. Finn appointed himself in charge of carrying small pieces of burnt timber from the yard to a pile at the property edge, a task he executed with total seriousness and no complaints despite its being tedious and slightly too heavy for him and taking much longer than it needed to. Margaret cooked dinner on the stove that was, remarkably, working. The cast iron had survived everything, and the smell of food cooking in the kitchen moved through the smoke-stained house with a cheerful determination that was almost aggressive, like something that had decided to argue with the damage and was winning. They ate at the kitchen table, all four of them. Carl had been invited without discussion, simply told what time dinner was, at the table that Margaret's mother had owned, and that had survived the fire in the smoke-stained kitchen with the warped shelves and the stone floor and the window that let in the wet evening air. Finn ate everything on his plate and then looked at Margaret's plate and asked if she was going to finish her biscuit with the expression of someone already knowing the answer. Have it, she said. He took it and ate it and then climbed down from his chair and went around the table and climbed up onto the settle against the wall and lay down with Bess and was asleep within 4 minutes. The way children are sometimes, suddenly and completely, as if sleep had been waiting nearby for an opening. Carl finished his coffee, set the cup down, and said, I'll come back tomorrow to start on the barn debris. I appreciate it, Margaret said. He put on his hat, looked at Elias, then at Margaret. There was something in his look that was not quite knowing and not quite approval, but was in that general territory. The look of a man who has watched two people carefully for long enough to have an opinion, and whose opinion has recently been confirmed. Good land, he said. He meant it as more than it sounded. Good people on it. It'll come back. He left. Elias and Margaret cleaned up the dishes in the familiar near silence. The lamplight in the kitchen was warmer than the smoke-stained walls deserved. Through the window, the valley was dark and wet, and in its southern portion still marked by the occasional glow of a smoldering stump. Not dangerous, just persistent, the way fires are when they've gone into the ground and need time to finally give up. The banknote, Elias said. 60 days, she said. Less now. About 50. The north pasture cattle are fine. If we move fast on selling the south herd once the road... I know the math, she said. I've been running it. She handed him a plate to dry. It's close, it's very close, but it might work if the spring prices hold. I'll go to Carswell next week and talk to the bank directly, he said. Explain the fire loss and ask for an extension on the security, not the principal. If they see someone taking active steps, you'd go on my behalf? He looked at her. Unless you want to go yourself. I've been to that bank 7 times in the last 2 years on my own behalf, she said. I would not object to company. Then I'll go with you, he said. We go together. She handed him the last plate. He dried it and put it on the shelf. She drained the basin. Elias, she said. He turned. She was standing at the basin and she was looking at him with an expression that was, for the first time since he'd walked through her gate, completely unguarded. Not managed, not calculated, not held at a careful distance. Just her face, showing what was actually on it. Thank you, she said, for coming back, for all of it. The well and the fence and the cattle and going back for the photograph and she shook her head slightly. For coming back here in the first place, even though you had every reason to believe there was nothing here for you. He stood in the kitchen of the house that had survived. He thought about the gate that wasn't locked, about the rifle that got lowered, about 41 letters burned in a barrel by a man who believed he was protecting his daughter, about the road south in the smoke and the road north in the rain, and a 3-year-old boy who had packed his dead mother's photograph because he understood, somehow, that the things that matter are the things you carry. There was something here for me, he said. There always was. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she crossed the kitchen and she kissed him. Not tentatively, not carefully, but with the directness of someone who has been making difficult decisions all day and is comfortable with the weight of this one. He put his hand against her face and she let him, and the lamp burned on the kitchen table and outside the rain was almost done. And somewhere in the south pasture a coyote called once into the wet dark and received, this time, an answer. When she stepped back, she looked at him with an expression that was complicated in the particular way that things are complicated when they're real and imperfect and arrived at through 12 years of wrong turns. We're going to have to figure out what this is, she said. Yes, he said. We are. That's going to take time. I've got time, he said. I'm not going anywhere, Margaret. I think I've mentioned that. She almost smiled, the same almost smile he'd seen on the first evening, quick and contained. But this time it stayed a moment longer before she caught it. Come on, she said. It's late. She went to check on Finn, who was deeply asleep on the settle with Bess and showed no interest in being moved. She put the blanket over him and stood for a moment looking at him, and Elias stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her do it, and the house settled around them with the specific quiet of a place that has come through something hard and is still standing. Outside, the last of the rain came down soft and steady, and in the valley the ground received it, and the burned places accepted it, and somewhere under the ash the grass roots that had survived were doing what grass roots do, waiting for morning and the work that comes after. Morning came the way it does after hard rain, not gently, but honestly, the light arriving without ceremony through windows that still carried the faint brown tint of smoke residue on their glass. Elias was up before it fully arrived, which had been his habit for as long as he could remember, and he stood at the kitchen window with his first cup of coffee and looked at the valley the way you look at something you weren't sure you were going to see again. The damage was real in the morning light, no pretending around it. The south pasture was a flat gray-brown expanse where the grass had been, and the remains of the equipment shed were a low tangle of twisted metal at the property's edge, and the barn stood with its surviving walls and its missing roof, like a man who'd lost his hat in a storm and was deciding whether to be embarrassed about it. The fire break along the south line was scorched earth, dark and bare, but it was there, and it had held the line it needed to hold, and standing in the kitchen, Elias could trace its path and see exactly where the fire had been turned. He drank his coffee and made a list in his head. The barn roof was first. Carl had already sent word to the man in Deaver, and they expected him by end of week. The south fence needed another assessment after the rain, because wet ground moved posts in ways you didn't always notice immediately. The equipment shed was a full rebuild, which meant timber and hardware, and at least 2 weeks of concentrated work. The south pasture would reseed itself, mostly, given time and water, but there were sections along the creek where the fire had gone deep enough into the root system that it would need help. None of this was impossible. That was the thing he kept coming back to, standing at the window. None of it was beyond the range of what 2 people working steadily, with adequate materials and some help from neighbors who were, as it turned out, the kind of neighbors who showed up could accomplish over a season. Damaged was not the same as lost. He'd had to relearn that lesson a few times in his life, and he suspected he wasn't done relearning it yet, but this particular morning it felt true in a way that had traction. He heard Finn before he saw him, the small, deliberate footsteps of a child who is trying to be quiet and mostly succeeding. And then Finn appeared in the kitchen doorway in his socks with his hair still flat on one side from sleep, carrying the canvas bag he had apparently slept with. "Morning," Elias said. "Morning." Finn came and stood beside him at the window, looking out at the same view. After a moment he said, "Is that where the fire stopped?" "Right there at the south line. See that dark strip? That's the fire break we built." Finn looked at it with proprietary satisfaction. "We built that," he said. Carl and I built it, Elias said. You handed me about 40 rocks. Important rocks, Finn said. Very important rocks. Finn put his bag on the floor and leaned against the wall and looked out at the valley with the comfortable, assessing gaze of someone who has decided this is his place and is now simply taking inventory. He'd done this, Elias had noticed, from early on. This habit of standing somewhere and looking at it with that quiet, claiming quality, not aggressive, just settled. It was something he must have needed badly, after the years of moving, the different beds and different yards, and the constant provisional quality of everything. Something to look at and think, this one. Is Maggie up? Finn said. Not yet. She was up late. Elias looked at him. You were supposed to be asleep. I was mostly asleep, Finn said, with the precision of someone making a careful factual distinction. I heard talking in the kitchen. People talk in kitchens. Finn looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes that missed very little. Are you and Maggie going to be okay? He said. Elias considered the question honestly, the way Finn's questions generally required. Yes, he said. We are. Are you sure? As sure as you can be about something that takes time to find out. Finn thought about this. That's not very sure, he said. No, Elias agreed, but it's honest. Finn accepted this with a small nod and went to find Bess. The first month after the fire was the hardest kind of work. Not the dramatic, crisis-driven kind that runs on adrenaline and necessity, but the steady, unglamorous kind that runs on nothing except showing up. The roofer from Deaver came on Friday, a compact man named Aldous with 2 apprentices and a very specific set of opinions about timber quality that he shared freely whether or not anyone had asked. He and his crew worked 6 days and the barn had a roof again, not identical to the old one, newer lumber, and a slightly different pitch that Aldous insisted was superior and that Carl acknowledged was probably better while clearly having reservations about the change. Elias rebuilt the equipment shed himself, mostly, with Finn as his primary assistant and Carl's help on the days when the framing required more than 2 sets of hands. It took 11 days. The shed that resulted was not a beautiful building. It was a practical one, square and solid and built to last, with a better door than the original and 2 windows that the original hadn't had, because light in a workspace cost nothing and was worth something. Margaret handled the bank. She and Elias went to Carswell together on the second Tuesday after their return, as they'd agreed, and they sat across a desk from a man named Hartley, who had the particular expression of someone in possession of leverage who is deciding how hard to use it. Margaret presented the fire damage assessment, the cattle inventory, the projected spring sale figures, and a letter from the county assessor regarding fire loss valuation that she had spent 2 evenings writing. Elias sat beside her and said nothing until Hartley started talking about accelerated repayment timelines, at which point he asked a series of quiet, specific questions about the bank's own fire loss provisions and the terms of the original note that had the effect of narrowing Hartley's options considerably without anyone raising their voice. They came out with a 4-month extension on the security review and a reduced payment schedule for the intervening period that was still difficult but was survivable if the spring prices held. On the walk back to the wagon, Margaret said, "You knew those provisions." "I've been reading the note," he said. "Since when?" "Since about a week after I arrived." He helped her up to the wagon seat. "I wanted to understand what we were working with." She sat down and looked at him. "You didn't say anything." "I didn't want to presume." She looked at him for a long moment with that measuring expression that he knew by now was not skepticism, but rather the look of someone taking something seriously enough to examine it properly. "Thank you," she said, "for being the kind of man who reads the fine print." "My father's advice," he said. "He said never sign anything you haven't read and never complain about a thing you agreed to." "Smart man." "In some areas," Elias said, and left it at that. The spring sale came in the second week of April, and it came in higher than projected. Not dramatically. This wasn't the kind of story where the numbers work out perfectly, and everyone feels surprised by the good fortune. It was 7% above what Margaret had estimated, which translated to enough of a margin that the banknote felt manageable rather than theoretical. She sat at the kitchen table the evening after the sale with the ledger in front of her and ran the figures twice and then a third time. And when she looked up, her expression was not joy exactly, but the quieter, more durable thing that comes when something difficult has been gotten through and you can finally stop bracing for it. It works, she said. Yeah, Elias said from across the table. I mean, it actually works this season. If the summer pasture recovers enough for a fall sale, it'll recover, he said. The root system south of the creek line is intact. Another good rain and you'll see growth in 3 weeks. She looked at the ledger, then at him. You sound certain. I've been watching that pasture for 7 months, he said. I know what it's doing. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise, more like recognition. The look of someone noticing a thing they'd been seeing for a while without fully registering it. You do know it, she said, don't you? It's good land, he said. I told you that. She closed the ledger and sat back in her chair and looked at him with an openness that had been arriving in increments over the months. Not all at once, not on any particular day, but in the slow, honest way that trust actually builds between people who've been hurt before and are paying attention this time. Elias, she said. Margaret. I owe you something, she said. You don't owe me. Not money, she said. I owe you a clearer answer to what's been between us since you came back. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I've been letting things develop without saying them out loud, and I think that's not fair to you, given your history of not getting answers. He sat with that. All right, he said. Say them out loud. She looked at the table and then at him. I love this ranch, she said. I have loved it my whole life, and I fought for it alone for 2 years after Robert died. And I was prepared to keep fighting for it alone indefinitely. That's true. She paused. And I think I told myself when you came that what I was doing was making a practical arrangement. Help for a roof. Work in exchange for room. She shook her head slightly. That was not entirely honest of me. No, he said. Probably not. I knew who you were, she said. When you came through that gate, I knew what it was going to mean, having you here. I told myself I didn't, but I did. She stopped. And I let you stay not just because I needed a hand, but because, she looked at him directly, because I wanted to know if what I remembered was real, or if I'd made it into something larger than it was because I needed something to be angry about. And, he said, it was real, she said. What I remembered was real. That's the answer. She said it plainly, without decoration. And these 7 months have been difficult and uncomfortable, and also the first time in a very long time that this place has felt like somewhere I wanted to be, rather than somewhere I was obligated to keep. She paused. That's you. That's Finn. She stopped. That's what I wanted to say out loud. Elias sat at the table in the kitchen of the house that had survived and looked at the woman across from him who was not young and not uncomplicated and not without the marks of all the years that had happened to her. And he thought that this was probably the most honest conversation he had ever been a part of, and that it had taken 44 years and 400 miles and 1 significant fire to arrive at it, and that it was worth every mile of that. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She almost smiled. I know, she said. I believe you now. That's what I'm telling you. Finn came in from the yard at exactly the wrong moment and exactly the right one, tracking mud on the kitchen floor and carrying a piece of quartz he'd found near the creek that he was certain was significant. He stopped in the doorway, looked at both of them, assessed the atmosphere in the room with the accuracy of a child who has lived close to adults his whole short life and has developed good instruments. What? He said. Nothing, Elias said. Wipe your boots. They're already off, Finn said, pointing to his sock feet, which were not especially clean either. Then wipe your socks, Elias said. Finn looked at him. That doesn't make sense, he said, and went to show Margaret the quartz. She examined it with complete seriousness, turning it in her hands, asking appropriate questions about where exactly near the creek and how deep in the bank. Finn answered in detail. Elias watched them and felt the particular thing he'd felt that day on horseback, when Finn had been complimented by Margaret and had looked at her with unguarded joy. That complicated, wordless feeling that lived at the intersection of grief and gratitude, and something that was simply love, plain and difficult, and not available for reduction into something neater. Finn set the quartz on the table. He looked at Elias, then at Margaret, then back at Elias. Then he said, with the directness of a child who has decided a thing and sees no reason to make theater of it, Are we staying here? For real staying, not just for a while staying. Elias looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Finn. Her face did the thing it sometimes did around him. That involuntary softening, the expression that had been coming up more frequently over the months, and that she'd stopped trying to manage back down. Yes, she said, for real staying. Finn nodded. Okay, he said, and picked up the quartz and went to put it with his collection. Summer came, and the south pasture did what Elias had said it would do. Slowly, stubbornly, without any particular drama. By June, there was grass coming up through the ash layer in the lower sections. By August, the upper pasture was carrying cattle again, and the creek was running at a decent level. The equipment shed stood solid in the yard. The barn roof didn't leak. The well produced clean water every day without complaint. The neighbors came in ones and twos through the summer to help with what needed helping. This was not unusual for the territory, but it was more organized than usual. Ada Garfield sent Frank over on days when his leg allowed it, and he turned out to be good with wire and better with a post-hole digger than anyone had expected. The Pritchard boys helped with the barn repair and stayed for dinner and came back twice more because Margaret fed them properly, which their mother confirmed was not always guaranteed at home. Even Beaumont, the rancher who had evacuated with only his horse and his clothes, came by one Saturday and spent 6 hours clearing storm debris from the south fence line without being asked and left before dinner, without saying much except that it was good land and good fences deserved to be maintained. The valley rebuilt itself in the way that places rebuild after catastrophe, which is to say, imperfectly and unevenly, with some things coming back stronger and some things staying changed. The Dutton place was sold. The family had decided, after everything, that they were done with fire country and were going back east. The Garfield property survived, and Frank's leg eventually healed well enough that he was back on his horse by fall, though he walked with a slight change in his gait that the doctor said was permanent, and Frank treated as a minor inconvenience. The Hale Ranch was different by October than it had been in March. Not worse, and not simply restored, but genuinely different in the way that things are different when they've been tested and have come through with a clearer sense of what they're made of. Elias had become, without quite announcing it, the person who managed the land. Margaret ran the business side, the accounts, the bank, the sale negotiations, the decisions about which cattle to keep and which to sell and when. And Elias ran the physical operation, the pasture management and the equipment and the fencing and the water. It wasn't a division they'd sat down and agreed on. It had simply emerged from each of them doing what they were actually good at, and finding that the things they were good at happened to fit together without too much overlap or too much gap. There were still arguments. This is worth saying clearly, because the arguments were real, and some of them were not comfortable. There was a week in July when they had a serious disagreement about the south pasture rotation schedule that involved both of them saying things that were more blunt than diplomatic, and then spending a day working in separate parts of the property before Carl diplomatically pointed out to each of them privately that the other one wasn't entirely wrong, which Carl did with the serene neutrality of a man who has learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is state the obvious and leave. They came back to the disagreement the following evening and worked through it at the kitchen table with the ledger and a pencil and more honesty than was always comfortable, and arrived at a schedule that was neither of their original positions but was better than either one, which is what actually useful arguments produce when both people involved have decided to stay in the room. There was another argument in September about money, specifically about whether to use the fall sale surplus to buy new breeding stock or to extend the fire break on the eastern property line, which was a genuine strategic question with legitimate considerations on both sides, and which produced a conversation that went until well past midnight, and that Finn, who had stayed up to listen from the hallway, later described to Bess as the loud talking, with a tone that suggested he found it more interesting than alarming. They bought the breeding stock and extended the fire break. This was the actual answer, arrived at when Margaret said flatly that she refused to choose between protecting the land and improving it, when they could do both if they were careful with the timing, and Elias looked at the numbers and said she was right, and they should have led with that, and she said she'd tried to lead with it, and he'd gotten in the way, and he said that was fair. Not perfect, not smooth. Genuinely two people with their own histories and their own strong ideas about how things ought to be done, living in close proximity and making it work through a combination of respect and stubbornness, and the occasional willingness to be wrong in front of someone who noticed. In November, Finn turned 4. Margaret made him a cake, which was the first cake that had appeared in the Hale kitchen in a long time, and Finn sat at the table and looked at it with an expression of pure reverence before blowing out the candles in 2 attempts. Carl came for dinner. Ada Garfield sent a jar of preserves. Frank sent a carved wooden horse that he'd made during the long weeks of his recovery, and which Finn immediately named Josephine after the difficult cow, a name choice that Margaret received with an expression of complicated amusement. After dinner, Finn fell asleep in the front room with Bess, and Carl went home, and Elias and Margaret sat on the porch in the cold November dark with their coffee cups, and the valley was quiet around them, and the windmill turned in the slight wind with the steady, patient sound it had been making for as long as the ranch had existed. "He's 4, Margaret said. "Yeah. He was 3 when you came through that gate." "He was. Almost exactly a year ago." She was quiet for a moment. "He called me Mom last week," she said. Elias looked at her. "We were in town, at the general store. He wanted to ask me something, and I was across the store, and he called out, 'Mom,' just like that." She held her cup in both hands. Hattie Burroughs was standing right there. She looked at me, and I didn't know what to... I just answered him. I just said what? Like it was normal. "Is it?" he said. "Normal?" She thought about it honestly. "It feels normal," she said. "That's what surprised me. I expected it to feel strange or complicated or like something that needed explaining, and it just felt like what it was. He needed something and he called for me." She paused. I answered. Elias looked at the dark valley. "He had a mother," he said. "Ruth. She was a good woman, and he doesn't remember her the way he will when he's older, but he has her photograph and he knows her name, and when he's ready to have those conversations, we'll have them." He paused. "And you're not replacing that. You know that." "I know that," she said. "You're just also true," he said. "Both things can be true." She looked at him. The cold air was still, and the stars above the valley were very clear, the way they get in November when the last of the season's haze has finally cleared away. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "Whatever you've been working up to for the last 3 months," she said. "I can see you working up to it. You think you're subtle, but you're not particularly." He almost smiled. "I'm not subtle?" "Not to me," she said. "Ask." He set his coffee cup on the porch rail. He looked at her, at the gray streak in her hair that had gotten a little wider since spring, and the lines at the corners of her eyes, and the way she held herself with the particular posture of a person who has carried their own weight for a long time, and is not ashamed of the strength it has required. He looked at her and thought about gates and letters and fires and pastures and arguments about cattle rotation and a small boy who called out for her in a general store without thinking about it. "I want to spend the rest of my life here," he said, "with you, on this land, doing this work, raising that boy." He paused. "I want to marry you, Margaret, not because of what we lost, not to make up for 12 years or fix what your father broke or fill anything in, because of what's actually here. What's between us right now, today, because of who you actually are and what we've actually built." He stopped. "That's what I've been working up to." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold November dark. "You know I'm difficult," she said. "I've noticed," he said. "I have opinions about everything." "I've noticed that too." "I'm not going to become someone who defers," she said. "That's not in me. I know that. I don't want that. We're going to keep arguing about things." "Probably," he said. "I intend to be right about most of them." "You intend to be wrong about most of them," she said. "That's been my experience." "See," he said. "This is exactly why I want to marry you. Nobody else would say that." She looked at him. The almost smile came, and this time she let it become an actual one, real and unguarded and belonging entirely to this moment, and it was the best thing he'd seen in a year that had contained some remarkable things. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you'll marry me, or yes, you agree that nobody else would say that." "Both," she said. He picked up her hand from where it rested on the arm of the chair and held it, and she let him, and the windmill turned and the valley was quiet all the way to its furthest edge. They were married in March, a year and 4 months after he'd come through her gate with Finn on his back and nothing much else to offer. The ceremony was small. The county judge, Carl Briggs as witness, Ada and Frank Garfield, the Pritchard family, and Finn standing very straight in the new shirt Margaret had made him, holding Bess's collar with one hand and a piece of quartz with the other, because he decided both were necessary and no one had argued the point. The ranch that spring was the best it had been in years. The south pasture was fully recovered. The new breeding stock had come through the winter in good condition. The well was clean and the barn roof was solid and the equipment shed was stocked properly, and the fire break along the south and east lines was the best in the valley. People started coming to Elias with questions about pasture management and water systems and fire prevention, and he answered them the way his father had answered questions, directly and without making anyone feel foolish for asking. Margaret handled the accounts with the same competence she'd always had, and now with someone across the table who understood the numbers and could think through the decisions with her, she had the additional resource of a second set of eyes on a problem, which she used selectively and on her own terms, which was exactly how it needed to work. Finn grew. This is the obvious thing, the thing that happens regardless, but it deserves saying because the way Finn grew was particular to who he was. He grew into a boy who could work alongside adults and be genuinely useful rather than decorative, who talked to animals with the patient seriousness of someone who believed they had relevant opinions, who asked questions until he understood things, and then retained what he understood with a tenacity that occasionally frustrated the adults around him when he recalled something they'd said months ago and used it in an argument. He had his mother Ruth's dark eyes and her quality of absolute stillness when she was listening hard. He had Elias's stubbornness about things he'd decided were right, and he had something that was entirely his own, a particular attentiveness to people, a way of noticing when someone was carrying something hard without being asked, that was not taught and could not be taught, and that Margaret, who recognized it because she had her own version of it, quietly regarded as his most important inheritance. He called Margaret Mom without any discussion, and it was not a complicated thing. It was what it was. Years later, when Finn was old enough to have earned the right to an opinion about his own history, he would say that the thing he remembered most from that first year was not the fire, though the fire was the most dramatic event. What he remembered most was the feeling of watching two people choose each other, slowly and imperfectly, and in full view of all the reasons they might not. He said this to his own wife one evening on the porch of the house he and she had built on the eastern section of the Hale land that Margaret had deeded to him on his 21st birthday, the same year he'd gotten his first cattle to manage as his own. And she had said, "That's an unusual thing for a child to understand," and he'd said, "I didn't understand it then. I just watched it. I understood it later." That is perhaps what the whole of it comes down to. Not the letters, though the letters matter. Not the fire, though the fire was real. Not even the years of silence, which were genuinely unjust and cost both of them something they never entirely got back. What it comes down to is the choosing, the daily, undramatic, imperfect choosing that is what love actually looks like when it's not performing itself for anyone. Howard Hale burned 41 letters because he was certain he knew what his daughter needed. And he was wrong in the way that people are wrong when they trust their own certainty more than they trust the person in front of them. That wrongness had consequences that rippled through 12 years and 3 lives, and there is no clean resolution to that, no way to account for it that makes it not have happened. Margaret knew this. Elias knew this. They did not pretend it could be unknowed or undone. They just decided, at a certain point, that it was not going to be the last word on either of their lives. That is a decision. It is not a feeling that arrives and carries you forward. It is a choice you make with your eyes open, knowing the cost of it, knowing that choosing to continue is not the same as forgetting what was lost. On a November evening some years on, when the ranch was running well and Finn was 12 and had opinions about everything, and Bess had been gone for 2 years and been replaced by one of her own pups, whom Finn had named Howard, which everyone agreed was a complicated choice of name, but Finn had his reasons and stated them with characteristic directness. Elias came in from the south pasture and found Margaret on the porch with a letter in her hand. Not his kind of letter. A business letter from the land registry confirming the final payment on the banknote. The last one. The note that Robert had taken out and that the fire had nearly made unpayable and that they had paid, steadily and without drama, for the years since. She was looking at it the way she looked at things that mattered. Carefully, completely, taking it seriously. He sat in the other chair. "That's it," she said. "Yeah. The land is ours, clear. He looked at the valley in the November light, the south pasture, fully recovered now and better for the recovery, and the barn with its newer roof, and the equipment shed that he'd built, and the fire break along the south and east that had been extended twice more, and that people in the county now came to look at as a model of how to do it right. He looked at all of it and felt the particular weight of something that has been worked for, which is different from and more substantial than anything that simply arrives. "Margaret," he said. She looked at him. "You and your boy need a home," he said. She looked at him for a second without understanding, and then she understood, and her face did the thing it did sometimes, the involuntary, undefended thing. "That was me," she said. "I said that." "You did. You're not going to let me forget it." "Not for a while," he said. She shook her head and almost said something and then didn't say it, which meant it was something she was keeping for herself, which was her right. She folded the letter and held it in her lap and looked at the valley. And he looked at it too. And the windmill turned overhead with the steady sound it had been making for all the years of this story, neither rushing nor stopping, just continuing, which is all any of us can do with the time we're given. Inside, Finn was telling Howard the dog something at considerable length. Outside, the light fell across the land they had saved, and the land fell away into the valley, and the valley held everything they had built and lost and rebuilt and chosen, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a life.